Hey everyone, and welcome back to History Simplified. Today we're talking about that time when Indonesia broke up with the Netherlands after a 350-year relationship, sparking the world's longest, most passive-aggressive decolonization text chain. Think of it as the world's worst group project where the Netherlands did none of the work for centuries but still expected to get all the credit and all the spices. Japan crashes the project halfway through, deletes all the files, and then the UN has to be called in as a mediator to stop them from throwing chairs. We're going to simplify this so much that actual historians will probably break out in hives. Before the inevitable betrayal starts, if you enjoy this highly inaccurate but fun version of history, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us buy more silly hats for the next video. Alright, grab some popcorn. Things are about to get unnecessarily complicated. Our story begins in the glorious, humid, and extremely resource-rich archipelago known as the Dutch East Indies. For centuries, this was the Netherlands' golden goose, their tropical cash cow, well, you get the picture. It was the place they went to get very, very rich off of things like rubber, oil, tin, and spices, all while telling themselves they were on a noble, civilizing mission. The Dutch ruled with the kind of smug paternalism that only a centuries-old colonial power can muster. They were the landlords of an unfathomably vast and beautiful estate, and they had long since forgotten that the people living there weren't just part of the scenery. Then came World War II, the great global bender that rearranged everyone's furniture. In 1940, Germany, in its infinite wisdom, decided to goose-step all over the Netherlands. This was a bit of a problem for the Dutch colonial administration chilling out in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. Their boss was now officially working from a government in exile in London, and their ability to project power was, to put it mildly, compromised. They were like a regional manager whose head office had just been replaced by a smoking crater. Enter Japan. Riding high on its own imperial ambitions, Japan looked at the Dutch East Indies and saw a gas station with a help-wanted sign out front. They needed oil, desperately. The US had cut them off, and their entire war machine was running on fumes. So in early 1942, they rolled up, kicked the Dutch out with surprising ease, and took over the archipelago. For the Dutch, this was the ultimate humiliation. Not only had they been conquered at home, but their most prized possession had just been snatched by the new bully on the block. The Netherlands was officially down and out, left to send strongly worded letters from London, while Japan settled into their tropical villa. Now, Japan's whole marketing pitch was the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was a wonderfully Orwellian name for Asia, but under our management. They arrived claiming to be liberators, brothers in arms freeing their fellow Asians from the boot of the white European colonizer. For a hot minute, some Indonesians were cautiously optimistic. Maybe this would be an improvement. Spoiler alert, it was not. The Japanese occupation was brutal, extractive, and often far more cruel than Dutch rule had been. But, and this is a huge but, Japan did something the Dutch had steadfastly refused to do. They broke the myth of European invincibility. They had kicked out a major colonial power in a matter of weeks. And because they were short on administrators and needed local support to run the place, they started training and empowering Indonesian nationalists. They gave prominent figures like Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta a platform, allowing them to speak to the masses. They even created and armed a volunteer Indonesian army called PITA, Pembela Tanah Air, or Defenders of the Homeland. From Japan's perspective, this was just good management. Why waste Japanese manpower on bureaucratic tasks when you can get the locals to do it? It's the colonial equivalent of outsourcing your customer service department. What they were actually doing was handing a loaded gun, a megaphone, and a political science degree to a generation of people who were really, really tired of being told what to do. For 3.5 years, this was the status quo. Then, in August 1945, the entire world changed in a flash. 2 of them, actually. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the final, deafening chords of World War II. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito broadcast his surrender to a stunned Japanese military. In Indonesia, Japanese soldiers who had been masters of the islands just a day before were suddenly nothing. They were a lame duck administration with one order: maintain the status quo until the Allies arrived to accept their surrender. This created a power vacuum so immense you could hear it whistling. The old landlord, the Netherlands, was still scrambling to find a boat back from Europe. The current psychotic house-sitter, Japan, had just been fired via nuclear explosion. And the tenants, the Indonesian nationalists, were standing in the living room, fully armed, looking at each other and realizing the house was empty. This is where the real mess begins. The younger, more radical Indonesian nationalists, the Pemuda, were practically vibrating with revolutionary energy. They saw their chance. This wasn't just a window of opportunity. It was a gaping, city-sized hole in the fabric of colonial history. They knew the Dutch were coming back, and they knew the Allies would try to hand the keys right back to them. They had a few days, maybe a week, to change the locks. Personified dialogue setting. A crackly, humid radio room in Batavia. A Japanese general stares at a surrender decree that might as well be written in Martian. He gets on the line with his superior in Tokyo. Batavia General. Sir, confirming the transmission. Unconditional surrender. We are to maintain order. But the nationalists we've been arming, Sukarno's people, they're practically planning a parade. They think this is their moment. Tokyo General. Sighs, the sound of a 1,000-year empire collapsing. Order. Yes, of course. Look, the Dutch are on their way. The British will probably get here first. Our official duty is to hand everything over to them, neat and tidy. Batavia General. And unofficially, sir? Tokyo. General. Unofficially, we just lost a war. Our cities are gone. The Emperor has spoken. But wouldn't it be a shame if, upon their return, our European friends found the front door barricaded and the house redecorated in nationalist colors? A final, deeply inconvenient gift for the people who put us in this position. Batavia General. So you're saying I should accidentally drop the keys to the armory where Sukarno's friends can find them? Tokyo. General. I'm saying that our soldiers are very demoralized. Mistakes will be made. Equipment will be lost. Documents will be misplaced. Let's give our fellow Asians a fighting chance. It will make the coming decades far more interesting for the Dutch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go ritually burn my dress uniform. And that's the apathetic, spite-fueled catalyst that set the stage for revolution. Japan's final act in Indonesia wasn't one of grand strategy. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a bitter employee leaving a fish in the air vents on their last day. They knew they couldn't keep the house, but they could sure as hell make it miserable for the next owner. This is the absolute absurdity of decolonization. It's rarely a clean, planned process. More often, it's a chaotic mess born from the ashes of a bigger, dumber conflict. The freedom of millions of people in Indonesia was not secured in a stately parliament or through peaceful petitions. It was sparked in a moment of imperial collapse, where the outgoing fascist empire decided to give the incoming colonial empire one last kick in the shins out of pure, unadulterated spite. History, folks, is driven by grand ideas, economic forces, and petty, petty revenge. The Dutch, meanwhile, were still picking out curtains for their triumphant return to Batavia, completely oblivious that their house was about to be claimed by its residents. The surprise party was ready, and they weren't going to like the cake. So the stage is set. The Japanese are defeated, demoralized, and feeling petty. The Dutch are somewhere over the horizon, fantasizing about their triumphant return to power. And in Indonesia, a generation of young, battle-hardened, and fiercely idealistic nationalists known as the Pemuda are looking at their watches, realizing it's go time. The only problem? Their leaders, the respectable, statesmanlike duo of Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta, were being annoyingly statesmanlike. They were cautious. They wanted to wait, to get confirmation of the Japanese surrender, to make sure they weren't about to sign their own death warrants on a rumor. Sukarno, the great orator, the man who could move mountains with his speeches, was basically telling everyone to hold their horses. For the Pemuda, this was infuriating. Holding horses was the opposite of revolution. To them, caution was just a fancy word for cowardice. They saw this tiny, perfect window between the collapse of one empire and the return of another, and they watched in horror as their leaders seemed intent on letting it close. So, they did what any group of impulsive young people would do when faced with parental dithering. They staged an intervention, a very, very forceful intervention. On the morning of August 16, 1945, a group of Pemuda showed up at Sukarno's house, bundled him and Hatta into a car, and spirited them away to the small town of Rengasdengklok. This event is often called a kidnapping, but it was less of a violent abduction and more of the most intense peer pressure session in modern history. It was the political equivalent of your friends dragging you to a party you said you were too tired to go to, except the party was national sovereignty. They took them out of Jakarta to get them away from the remaining Japanese influence and the more conservative elements of the Indonesian elite. Their argument was simple: declare independence. Now. Right now. Do it for the people, not as a gift from the Japanese. Do it before the Allies get here and this whole thing gets 1,000 times more complicated. After a full day of what I can only imagine was extremely passionate and possibly very loud conversation, Sukarno and Hatta caved. The youths were right. The moment was now or never. They were driven back to Jakarta, arriving late at night, with a nation to create before sunrise. And this is where the story takes a turn for the truly bizarre. Where do you go to write the founding document of your new country, the sacred text of your liberation? A grand hall? A university? A secret revolutionary hideout? Nope. You go to the house of a Japanese rear admiral, specifically Admiral Tadashi Maeda, a man who was, for reasons of his own, quite sympathetic to the Indonesian cause. Just try to picture this scene. It's 2 a.m. Sukarno, Hatta, and a few other key figures are huddled around the Admiral's dining room table, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, drafting the Proclamation of Independence on a scrap of paper. Meanwhile, their host, a senior officer of the empire that had brutally occupied them for 3 years, is pottering around making sure they have enough snacks and that nobody from the military police interrupts them. It's so surreal it sounds like a rejected Wes Anderson script. By dawn, they had it. The text was short, simple, and to the point. No flowery language, no lengthy justifications. It was the single most impactful text message in Southeast Asian history. It read, "We, the people of Indonesia, hereby declare the independence of Indonesia. Matters which concern the transfer of power and other things will be executed by careful means and in the shortest possible time." That's it. It's basically the political version of "I'm breaking up with you. We'll sort out who gets the dog later." KTHX by, on the morning of August 17, 1945, in the front yard of Sukarno's house, history was made. There was no giant crowd, no international press, just a few hundred eager patriots. A simple, hand-sewn red and white flag was run up a bamboo flagpole. Sukarno stepped up to a microphone and read the proclamation. In that moment, the Republic of Indonesia was born. The text was sent. The question was, who was reading it? Personified dialogue setting. A dusty, ornate office in The Hague. The Netherlands, personified as a stuffy old aristocrat, is reviewing shipping manifests, dreaming of cloves and rubber. An aide rushes in with a telegram. Aide: "Sir, we have news from the East Indies. It seems a local politician named Sukarno has made some sort of declaration. Netherlands," without looking up. A declaration? How lovely. Are they declaring a new holiday in my honor? It's about time. Let me guess, glorious return of the benevolent Dutch Day? Aide: "Not exactly, sir. He's declared independence. Netherlands." Finally looks up, blinking slowly. Independence? What does that even mean? Is that a new type of spice? Did they find it on Borneo? Aide: "No, sir. As in, they believe they are a country now. Their own country. They're calling themselves Indonesia. Netherlands." Stares for a full 10 seconds, then bursts into a hearty, condescending laugh. "Oh, that's rich. Adorable. Absolutely adorable. Sukarno. The fellow we jailed a few years back? The one who then worked for the Japanese? Oh, the Japanese must have put him up to this as a joke. It's a prank. A final silly little prank before we arrive to restore proper adult supervision. Aid. The reports seem quite serious, sir. They've raised a flag. Netherlands. A flag. Well, that settles it then. Let them have their fun. We'll be there in a few months. Tell the military to pack a few extra flags of our own. The big ones. This Indonesia will be over by Christmas. And right there, you see the fatal flaw in the Dutch plan. An absolutely impenetrable wall of arrogance. They heard Declaration of Independence and processed it as local festival. They could not, on a fundamental level, comprehend that the people they had ruled for 3.5 centuries saw themselves as, well, people. People who were capable of, and now insistent on, governing themselves. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a deep, philosophical chasm. The Dutch saw the proclamation as an illegal act of treason orchestrated by Japanese collaborators. The Indonesians saw it as the righteous, inevitable culmination of their national destiny. This is the moment the text chain truly begins. Indonesia sends the first message. We are a sovereign nation. The Netherlands sees the notification, chuckles to itself, and replies with a read receipt and complete, utter silence. They didn't even bother with LOL. In their minds, there was nothing to reply to. You don't negotiate with your furniture, even if the furniture has started shouting political slogans. This spectacular failure to read the room, to understand the seismic shift that had occurred during the war, was the single biggest mistake the Dutch would make. They assumed they could just show up and things would go back to normal. But the normal they remembered had been burned to the ground, and a new, fiery, and unpredictable reality was rising from its ashes. The message had been sent, but the recipient wasn't just ignoring it. They were convinced it was a wrong number. While the new Indonesian Republic was frantically trying to build a government out of revolutionary spirit and whatever office supplies they could find, and the Netherlands was still confidently steaming across the ocean, a third party entered the chat. This wasn't just any party. This was Great Britain, showing up fashionably late and looking utterly exhausted. Fresh off the high of winning a world war, Britain was now saddled with the planet's biggest hangover and a to-do list the length of the Thames. At the top of that list, under the heading Southeast Asia Command, SEAC, was the Dutch East Indies. Their mission, handed down by the dapper Lord Mountbatten, was supposed to be simple, a straightforward bit of post-war tidying up. Think of Britain as the designated driver at the end of a very long, very destructive party. All they wanted to do was collect the car keys from the drunk guy, Japan, make sure everyone who passed out on the lawn gets home safely, the Allied POWs, and then go home to a well-deserved cup of tea and a nap. Their orders were explicit. 1. Accept the Japanese surrender. 2. Disarm and repatriate some 300,000 Japanese troops scattered across the islands. 3. Liberate and care for the tens of thousands of Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees, most of whom were Dutch. And, most importantly, the fine print on their mission briefing included a massive, bold, underlined clause: do not get involved in local politics. Britain was not there to fight a new war to hand Indonesia back to the Dutch on a silver platter. Their new Labour government back home was already getting twitchy about the whole empire thing, and the British public, after 6 years of the Blitz, had absolutely zero appetite for more foreign adventures. So, in late September 1945, the first British forces landed in Batavia, expecting to find a state of total chaos. What they found was confusing. Yes, it was chaotic, but it was an organized chaos. The city wasn't a lawless vacuum. It was the capital of a self-proclaimed republic. There were red and white flags everywhere. Walls were covered in revolutionary slogans like Merdeka atau Mati, freedom or death. There were actual government ministries operating, however haphazardly, out of old Dutch colonial buildings. The local British commander, a pragmatic chap named General Christison, took one look at this situation and realized his neat little to-do list had just been set on fire. His primary mission was to find and rescue the Allied POWs, who were in camps deep in the interior of Java. The people who controlled the roads, the railways, and communications in the interior were not the Japanese anymore. It was this new Republican government. So Christensen did the sensible thing. He made a public statement that the British had no intention of interfering with Indonesian politics, and that he would have to deal with the de facto authorities to achieve his mission. For the Indonesian Republic, this was a massive diplomatic win. A major world power had just implicitly acknowledged their existence. They were thrilled. The Dutch, on the other hand, were absolutely incandescent with rage. And this is where the real trouble starts. Because Britain, the unwilling chaperone, didn't come to the party alone. Hiding behind their legs, peeking out with an entitled smirk, was the Netherlands Indies Civil Administration, or NICA. These were the Dutch colonial officials, the landlords who had been kicked out 3 years prior, and they were riding on the coattails of the British military, ready to resume business as usual. The moment their boots hit the ground, they started acting like they owned the place because, in their minds, they still did. They ignored the British pleas for caution and immediately started trying to reassert Dutch authority, arresting suspected collaborators and running the Dutch flag up any pole they could find. They were the X who shows up with the movers, assuming the breakup was just a funny phase we were all going through. Setting: a sweltering makeshift command tent in Batavia. Britain is staring wearily at a map. Netherlands, dressed in a slightly too warm colonial suit, bursts in, waving a piece of paper. Netherlands: Britain, I must protest. Your General Christensen is negotiating with the terrorists. He used the words de facto authorities. He's legitimizing them. Britain doesn't look up from the map. Good morning to you too, Netherlands. Look, my primary concern is getting your 100,000 people out of squalid prison camps before they all die of disease. The fellow who calls himself president happens to be the one who can guarantee my convoy's safe passage. It's called pragmatism. You should try it sometime. Netherlands: pragmatism? It's treason. You're supposed to be helping me. You're the muscle. Your job is to kick down the door so I can repossess my property. Instead, you're knocking politely and asking the squatters for a cup of sugar. Britain, they are not squatters. They are several million people with guns, a flag, and a rather catchy national anthem. And my orders, which I suggest you read, say nothing about reconquest. They say, disarm Japan and liberate POWs. Every time one of your Nika chaps raises your flag over a post office, I get 100 angry young men with sharpened bamboo spears blocking a road my medical trucks need to use. So please tell your people to sit down, be quiet, and let the adults handle this. Netherlands: sputtering. This is an outrage. I shall write a very stern letter to your Prime Minister. Britain: do that. There's a cue. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a war to tidy up. And this is the tragedy of the well-intentioned but doomed chaperone. Britain was caught in an impossible bind. Every step they took to complete their actual mission was seen by the Dutch as a betrayal of their colonial rights. Every time they allowed a Nika official off the leash, it was seen by the Indonesians as proof that the British were just the advance team for their old colonial masters. They were trying to walk a tightrope, but the Dutch kept shaking one end while the Indonesians were setting the other end on fire. The meta-commentary here is on the sheer stubborn folly of trying to turn back the clock. The world of 1939 was gone, vaporized at Hiroshima. The age of European empires swaggering around the globe was breathing its last rattling breaths. Britain, being a pragmatic and frankly exhausted empire, could see this. They knew the game was changing. The Dutch, however, were suffering from a terminal case of nostalgia. They believed that with enough force and enough righteous indignation, they could make it 1939 again. This refusal to accept the new reality would turn what could have been a messy but manageable political transition into a bloody 4-year war. Britain just wanted to get the POWs out. They had no idea they were about to become unwilling referees in the first round of a championship fight for independence. The situation was a powder keg, and the city of Surabaya was about to provide the spark. If Batavia was the anxious, bureaucratic brain of the new Indonesian Republic, then the city of Surabaya was its roaring, furious heart. Located in East Java, Surabaya was a major port, a working-class city with a long history of radical politics, and it was absolutely buzzing with the revolutionary energy of the Pemuda. While the politicians in Batavia were trying to play nice with the British, the mood in Surabaya was decidedly less diplomatic. They had weapons, they had a cause, and they had zero patience for anyone who even vaguely smelled like a colonizer. So, naturally, this is where everything was about to go completely and spectacularly wrong. In late October 1945, a British Indian brigade sailed into Surabaya harbor, tasked with the usual: find the Japanese, disarm them, and get the POWs out. Standard procedure. But the commander on the ground immediately committed a blunder of world historical proportions. He authorized airdropping leaflets all over the city. These leaflets, in no uncertain terms, demanded that all Indonesians surrender their firearms to the British forces within 24 hours. Now you have to understand the context. These weren't just any firearms. Most of them had been acquired from surrendering Japanese soldiers. They were the symbol of the revolution's power, the one thing that gave them a fighting chance against the returning Dutch. Asking them to hand over their guns was like asking a new mother to hand over her baby. It was insulting, it was threatening, and it was seen as the clearest possible sign that the British were there to do the Dutch's dirty work. The city exploded. The Pemuda and various militia groups immediately saw this as a declaration of war. Fighting broke out everywhere as Indonesian fighters clashed with the newly arrived British Indian troops. The British commander, Brigadier A.W.S. Malaby, found himself in the middle of a hornet's nest he had just kicked over. To his credit, he realized the mistake and tried desperately to de-escalate. He raced around the city trying to negotiate a ceasefire. He even got President Sukarno himself flown in from Batavia to talk everyone down. For a moment, it seemed to work. A fragile truce was declared. But truces in the middle of a revolution are fragile things. On October 30th, communications collapsed, confusion reigned, and Brigadier Malaby's car was trapped and surrounded by an enraged Indonesian mob near the Red Bridge. Accounts of what happened next are a chaotic mess of contradiction, but the end result is undisputed. Shots were fired, a grenade was thrown, and Brigadier Malaby was killed. The revolution had just claimed its most high-profile victim, and the British Empire was not the forgiving type. News of Malaby's death sent shockwaves through the Allied command. This was no longer a policing action, it was an act of war. The British response was swift, emotional, and utterly uncompromising. They brought in the heavy cavalry, the 5th Indian Division, a battle-hardened unit of veterans, backed by Sherman tanks, heavy artillery, and the menacing guns of Royal Navy cruisers sitting in the harbor. The new commander, Major General Robert Mansur, issued an ultimatum to the city of Surabaya. It was simple. The leaders of the Indonesian resistance were to surrender by 6 a.m. on November 10th. All other armed Indonesians were to approach British positions, lay down their weapons, and submit to being searched. If they refused, the city would be subjected to the full force of modern warfare. This was the moment of truth. For the leaders in Surabaya, this was an impossible demand. Surrender was unthinkable, so they turned to the radio. A charismatic leader named Sutomo, better known as Bung Tomo, took to the airwaves, his voice cracking with passion, delivering speeches that would become legendary. He didn't just call for resistance, he called for a holy struggle, a fight to the death for honor, for God and for the motherland. He famously roared, "As long as the bulls of Indonesia still have red blood that can make a scrap of white cloth red and white, we will never surrender, freedom or death." Personified dialogue setting. The abstract, smoky backroom of historical forces. The spirit of 19th century imperialism, a portly figure in a pith helmet, is explaining his strategy to the lean, cynical spirit of modern nationalism. Imperialism. The strategy is sound, old boy. Impeccably sound. An officer has been killed. An example must be made. You deliver a stern ultimatum, rattle the saber, and if the blighters still won't listen, you deliver a short, sharp shock. A bit of naval bombardment, a few tanks rolling through the square. They'll see reason. It's how we built an empire, you know. Overwhelming force and a stiff upper lip. Nationalism takes a long drag from a cigarette. You really don't get it. You think you're talking to them, but you're not. Your ultimatum is the best recruiting speech they've ever heard. You're not offering them a choice between surrender and death. You're offering them a choice between humiliation and martyrdom. Which one do you think a revolution picks? Imperialism, but we have tanks and cruisers. They have sharpened bamboo. It's simple arithmetic. Nationalism. You're trying to solve a spiritual problem with explosives. Bad math. You'll take the city. You'll occupy the rubble. But you'll lose. Every man who dies fighting your tanks becomes a hero. Every house you destroy becomes a shrine. You think you're crushing a rebellion, but you're actually creating their national holiday. They'll call it Heroes' Day, and they'll celebrate it forever. You're about to win the battle and lose the entire narrative. And that's exactly what happened. On November 10, 1945, the ultimatum expired. The British unleashed a furious barrage. The Battle of Surabaya had begun. It was not the short, sharp shock the British had expected. It was a meat grinder. Tens of thousands of Indonesian fighters, many armed with little more than knives and spears, threw themselves at veteran soldiers backed by armor and air support. The battle raged for 3 weeks, a brutal house-to-house struggle through the bombed-out ruins of the city. The Indonesians had no chance of winning a conventional fight, but they made the British pay for every single street corner in blood. This is the ultimate paradox of asymmetrical warfare. The British military did exactly what it was designed to do. It applied overwhelming force and captured its objective. But in the process, it did exactly what the Indonesian Republic needed it to do. It created a legend. The Battle of Surabaya was a catastrophic military defeat for the Indonesians, but it was a staggering political and spiritual victory. The sheer ferocity of their resistance showed the world, and more importantly themselves, that the proclamation of independence wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a promise they were willing to die for. The battle transformed the image of the Indonesian struggle from a small-scale political dispute into an epic national war of liberation. Britain, the tired chaperone, had tried to break up a fight and had instead started a war, all while their Dutch friends were finally unpacking their bags, ready to take over the now raging inferno. After the bloody mess of Surabaya, Britain had officially had enough. Their role as the world's most reluctant chaperone was over. They looked at the inferno they were stuck in, looked at the Dutch ships finally arriving in force, and basically said, "He's all yours," before sprinting for the nearest exit. Throughout late 1945 and early 1946, a handover took place. Weary, tea-deprived British Tommies were replaced by fresh-faced, confident Dutch Marines. By November 1946, the last British transport ship had sailed away, leaving the two main characters of our drama alone in the room for the first time. And the vibe was, to put it mildly, tense. The Dutch arrived not with the caution of a party trying to de-escalate a conflict, but with the unshakable bone-deep certainty of a landlord arriving to evict a noisy tenant. They were led by Lieutenant Governor General Hubertus van Mook, a man who, despite having been born in the Indies, fundamentally could not grasp the idea that the Indies didn't want him back. In the Dutch worldview, the Republic of Indonesia was a fiction, a temporary bit of political theater staged by Japanese collaborators. Sukarno wasn't a president, he was a criminal. The Pemuda weren't a revolutionary army. They were gangs of extremists terrorizing a silent majority of loyal, simple-minded natives who were just yearning for the return of good, stable, profitable Dutch rule. This colossal miscalculation was the foundation of their entire strategy. They genuinely believed they were the good guys, the liberators saving the populace from itself. So the Netherlands Indies Civil Administration, NICA, got to work setting up shop in the cities they now controlled. They started reopening colonial offices, enforcing old Dutch laws, and generally acting as if the last 4 years, including the proclamation of independence, had been nothing more than a weird dream. They were the ex who, after being broken up with, shows up to your apartment with their toolbox, announcing they're here to fix that leaky faucet you've been complaining about for years, completely oblivious to the restraining order. To enforce this vision of restored order, they brought their army, the Royal Netherlands Indies Army, or KNIL. This is where the conflict gets even messier. The KNIL wasn't just an army of white soldiers from Europe. For centuries, it had been a professional colonial force with a large contingent of Indonesian soldiers recruited from specific ethnic groups. most famously the Ambonese from the Maluku Islands and the Menonese from Sulawesi. These soldiers were often Christian, had been educated in Dutch schools, and had a long-standing culture of loyalty to the Dutch crown and the House of Orange. When they were deployed against the overwhelmingly Muslim Javanese-led Republican Army, it turned the conflict from a simple war of independence into something with the bitter, tragic flavor of a civil war. It was Indonesian fighting Indonesian, a dynamic the Dutch were more than happy to exploit. The Dutch military strategy was straightforward and based on economics. They knew they didn't have enough troops to occupy every jungle and village in an archipelago of 17,000 islands. Instead, they focused on what they called the enclave strategy. They seized and secured the most valuable real estate, the major port cities like Batavia, Surabaya, and Semarang, and the resource-rich plantations and oil fields of Sumatra and Borneo. Their plan was to economically suffocate the Republic. If they could control all the points of import and export, they could cut off the revolutionaries from the outside world, starve them of revenue and weapons, and reduce them to an irrelevant gang of bandits in the Javanese countryside. Once the Republic was sufficiently weakened, the Dutch could then negotiate from a position of absolute strength, magnanimously offering them some form of limited autonomy within a Dutch-led federation. Full independence was never, ever on the table. Personified dialogue setting, the metaphorical front door of Indonesia. Netherlands has just used an old key to let himself in and is now standing in the foyer, dusting off his hands.
Indonesia stands opposite, arms crossed. Netherlands. There we are. Good to be back. Now, what in God's name have you done to the place? Slogans on the walls, cheap red and white curtains. It's terribly tacky. Not to worry. I've brought my Nika boys. They'll have this mess sorted in a jiffy. We'll get a fresh coat of orange paint on everything. It'll be lovely. Indonesia. This is my house now. I have a government. I have an army. I have a flag.
The sign on the door says, "The Republic of Indonesia." It does not say, "Welcome home, Netherlands." Netherlands lets out a weary sigh, as if explaining something to a toddler. Look, you've had your little adventure. The Japanese came, you played revolutionaries, it was all very exciting. But the grown-ups are back now. We have important business to attend to. Rubber, oil, the usual. We can't have you lot disrupting the cash flow with all this freedom nonsense. Indonesia, we will fight you for every inch of it. Netherlands, smirks. You'll try. But my KNIL soldiers know this house better than you do. Some of them are your cousins, you know. Now stop this foolishness. I'm prepared to be reasonable. We can set you up with your own room, maybe even let you pick the color, as long as you remember who pays the mortgage. The Dutch mindset is a perfect, tragic example of a psychological phenomenon known as motivated reasoning. They had a conclusion they desperately wanted to be true, that the Indonesian people wanted them back, so they selectively interpreted all information to fit that conclusion. Widespread armed resistance? That's just the work of a few extremists. Mass popular support for Sukarno? Clearly, the people are being intimidated. A functioning Republican government? A puppet show propped up by the Japanese. This inability to perceive reality was not just arrogance, it was an existential necessity. To admit that Indonesia was a unified nation that genuinely hated them would be to admit that their entire 350-year colonial project had been a lie. It's far easier to launch a police action against a few thousand terrorists than it is to declare war on the hopes and dreams of 70 million people. So, by mid-1946, the board was set. The British were gone, having successfully washed their hands of the whole affair. The Dutch held the cities, the ports, and the money. The Republic controlled the countryside, the villages, and the hearts of the people. It was a classic stalemate. The war was about to enter a new phase, a grinding, brutal conflict in the jungles and rice paddies, punctuated by moments of excruciatingly awkward attempts at diplomacy. The X was back in the house, and they were refusing to leave. With the Dutch now firmly in control of the cities and the Republic dug into the countryside, a tense and bloody stalemate settled over the archipelago. Since neither side had the strength to deliver a knockout blow, and with the last of the British mediators nervously eyeing the exit, They were reluctantly forced to do the one thing both of them dreaded: talk. And so began the diplomatic phase of our breakup, which can best be described as a series of the most excruciatingly awkward coffee dates in history. Both parties sat at the table, but they had fundamentally different ideas about the purpose of the meeting. The Republic of Indonesia came to the table to negotiate the terms of a divorce. The Netherlands came to suggest couples counseling, contingent on Indonesia admitting it had been hysterical and moving back home immediately. The gap between their starting positions wasn't just a gap, it was a canyon, a vast, unbridgeable chasm of perception. The Dutch, led by Van Mook, came with what they considered an incredibly generous, modern, and forward-thinking offer. They would graciously agree to stop ruling Indonesia directly. Instead, they would create a brand new, shiny federal entity called the United States of Indonesia. This USI would be a collection of self-governing states: West Java, East Borneo, the Great East, and so on. The scrappy little Republic of Indonesia, the one with Sukarno, could be one of those states, specifically the bit in central Java they still controlled. And this whole federation would then be joined in a glorious Netherlands-Indonesian union with the Kingdom of the Netherlands, all under the benevolent Dutch crown. They'd get their own parliaments and local leaders, but naturally, the Netherlands would handle the big boy stuff: foreign policy, military defense, and of course the overall economic strategy. To the Dutch, this was a monumental concession. They were offering a partnership. The Indonesian delegation, led by their intellectual and pragmatic Prime Minister Sultan Syahrir, would listen to this proposal, nod politely, and then deliver their response, which, paraphrased, went something like this: "That's a fascinating fantasy novel you've written. We appreciate the effort. However, you seem to be operating under the misapprehension that we are a colony asking for autonomy. We are not. We are a sovereign nation that declared its independence on August 17, 1945. Our existence is not up for debate. Our sovereignty is not a concession you can grant. The only thing we are here to discuss is the formal recognition of that sovereignty and the subsequent transfer of all remaining administrative functions to us. Once you've done that, we can have a lovely chat about your economic interests and how we can all move forward as two separate, independent countries." You can see the problem. One side was offering to redecorate the prison cell, and the other side was insisting they had already left the prison, changed their name, and started a new life in another town. They weren't even in the same conversation. This dynamic was perfectly encapsulated by the Hoge Veluwe talks in April 1946. The Dutch invited an Indonesian delegation all the way to a fancy estate in the Netherlands for high-level negotiations. After flying halfway around the world, the Indonesians were presented with the exact same federal union plan, with no room for movement on the central issue of Republican sovereignty. The Dutch politicians, feeling secure on their home turf, thought they could strong-arm the upstart Republic into accepting their reasonable offer. The talks collapsed in spectacular failure, achieving nothing except for mutual frustration and a very large carbon footprint. The Indonesian delegates flew home, now utterly convinced that diplomacy with the Dutch was a waste of time. Setting: a sterile, metaphorical negotiation room. A weary British diplomat plays the role of mediator for the last time before catching his flight home. Mediator, Britain. Right, let's try this one more time. Netherlands, you have the floor. What is your offer? Netherlands, beaming with self-satisfaction. My offer is one of unparalleled generosity. I am prepared to elevate my beloved Indies to the status of a partner. We will form a union. They can have their own little governments, their own flags, different colored ones for each region. It'll be very festive. All cozy and safe under my royal protection. I'll still manage the checkbook, of course, can't have them being irresponsible. Mediator, Britain. Sighs. Indonesia? Your response? Indonesia. My response is that my name is Indonesia, not the Indies. And my response is no. My response is recognize my sovereignty. That is not a negotiating point, it is the ticket of admission to this entire conversation. Netherlands. But this is absurd. I am the sovereign. It says so on all the old maps. You can't just declare yourself sovereign any more than my tulip bulbs can declare themselves a monarchy. Indonesia. Watch me. We already did. While your country was occupied, we were busy becoming a nation. Your maps are out of date. Netherlands. Scoffs. This is impossible. You're being emotional. This is what happens when you let the collaborators run things. They are completely unreasonable. Mediator. Britain. Stands up. Packs his briefcase. Okay. Well, my flight is boarding. It seems you two have a lot to talk about. Don't call me. Good luck. He sprints out of the room, leaving a deafening silence behind him. This is the fundamental tragedy of so many decolonization struggles. It's a dialogue of the deaf. The colonizing power is so trapped in its own paternalistic worldview that it is psychologically incapable of seeing the colonized as equals. The Dutch couldn't process the Indonesian demand for sovereignty as a legitimate political aspiration. They could only see it as insolence, as the petulance of a child who doesn't understand what's good for it. They weren't negotiating a peace treaty between two nations. They thought they were laying down the house rules for a rebellious teenager. And when you treat a nation of 70 million people like a teenager, you shouldn't be surprised when they decide to burn down the house rather than follow your curfew. The failure of these early talks had a chilling effect. Any moderates on the Dutch side who might have pushed for a quicker, cleaner break were sidelined by hardliners who now felt completely justified. You see, they argued, we offered them a perfectly good deal, and they spat in our faces. They don't understand diplomacy. They only understand force. On the Indonesian side, the exact same thing happened. Leaders like Shahrir, who had argued for a diplomatic solution, lost ground to those who insisted the Dutch would never give up the Indies without being forced out at gunpoint. The awkward coffee dates were over. Both sides walked away from the table, convinced that the only way to get a better deal next time was to improve their position on the battlefield. The talking had failed, so the shooting was about to get a whole lot louder. After the spectacular failure of the first round of talks, both the Netherlands and the Republic of Indonesia went back to their corners, put in their mouthguards, and resumed punching each other. The fighting through mid-1946 was a grinding, miserable affair. The Dutch military, with its superior firepower, could capture any town or road it wanted. But the moment its patrols left, Republican guerrillas would emerge from the villages and rice paddies and take it right back. The Dutch were winning every battle, but making no strategic progress. The Republic, meanwhile, was surviving on sheer grit and popular support, but its amateur army was taking a beating, and its blockaded economy was gasping for air. Both sides were exhausted, bleeding resources and slowly realizing that a purely military victory was impossible. And so, inevitably, they decided to give the awkward coffee dates another try. This time, the setting was the cool mountain town of Linggajati in West Java. Under the weary eye of the remaining British mediators, Dutch and Indonesian delegations huddled together in November 1946 to hammer out a deal. What they produced was the Linggajati Agreement, a document so full of constructive ambiguity and diplomatic wishful thinking that it, as a miracle, it didn't evaporate on contact with the humid jungle air. It was a masterpiece of letting both sides hear exactly what they wanted to hear. The agreement had 3 main points, each one a perfectly crafted Rorschach test. First, the Netherlands formally recognized the de facto authority of the Republic of Indonesia over the islands of Java, Madura, and Sumatra. For the Indonesian delegation, this was the headline, the money shot, the whole reason they showed up. Recognition. They popped the champagne. In their minds, the war was basically won. Second, the Republic of Indonesia agreed to cooperate with the Netherlands to form a sovereign, federal United States of Indonesia. For the Dutch, this was the headline. They high-fived each other. See? The Republic had just agreed to abandon its silly idea of a unitary state and embrace their much more sensible federal plan. Third, this new United States of Indonesia would then join the Netherlands, Suriname, and the Curaçao Islands in a Netherlands-Indonesian union, with the Dutch Queen as its symbolic head. The Dutch delegation did a little jig. Not only did the Republic agree to their federal model, but they also agreed to stay in the family. They were still the senior partner, the head of the household. If this sounds confusing and contradictory, that's because it was. The Lingga Agreement was a diplomatic illusion, a trick of the light that allowed two diametrically opposed parties to walk away thinking they had won. The Indonesians read it as a three-step process, where the first step, recognition of their sovereignty, was the only one that truly mattered. The federal state and the union were vague, future concepts they would enter into as an already independent nation. The Dutch read it as a single, indivisible package deal. The only reason they were granting temporary recognition to the Republic was as a means to an end, the creation of a federal state that would remain firmly under their control. The whole thing hinged on the definition of sovereign, a word both sides used constantly while having completely different dictionaries. Personified dialogue setting, a joint press conference after the signing. Netherlands and Indonesia are standing shoulder to shoulder, forcing smiles for the cameras and holding up the agreement. Reporter: a question for both of you. This agreement seems to contain contradictory elements. Who has the ultimate authority during this transition period? Netherlands chuckles smoothly. An excellent question. It's quite simple. As the historically sovereign power in the region, we will naturally oversee the formation of the new federal state to ensure a smooth and orderly transition. We are the architects of this grand new house. Indonesia leans into the microphone. With all due respect to my colleague, the agreement clearly recognizes our de facto authority. We are the recognized government in Java and Sumatra. We will be building our own house, and we have graciously invited the Dutch to consult on the color of the trim. Netherlands: the trim? I'm providing the bricks and the foundation. Indonesia: you're providing the moving van for you to leave in. Reporter: so you're not in agreement at all? Netherlands and Indonesia, in perfect unison. Of course we are. It's a fantastic agreement. They resume smiling, their hands locked in a handshake with enough pressure to crush diamonds. And if the two signatories couldn't agree on what they'd signed, you can bet the hardliners back home were having a field day. In the Dutch parliament, conservative and religious parties were screaming betrayal. The government was giving away the Indies, the jewel of the kingdom, to a bunch of Japanese-trained terrorists. They only ratified the treaty after adding a list of their own interpretations, which effectively reasserted ultimate Dutch sovereignty over everything, rendering the whole thing meaningless. Meanwhile, in the Republic, nationalist and Islamic factions accused their own government of treason. A federal state? A union under the Dutch Queen? This was a sellout. They had been fighting and dying for a 100% independent, unitary Republic of Indonesia, not some watered-down, Dutch-designed compromise. Military commanders on the ground openly scoffed at the ceasefire and continued their attacks. The Lingga Agreement, therefore, was not a peace treaty. It was a universally despised pause button that everyone was desperate to unpause. It's the classic relationship move of saying, let's take a break and see other people, when you both know you're just buying time to update your dating profiles and find a new apartment. It was a flimsy, fragile truce built not on trust but on mutual exhaustion and a shared desire to reload. Both sides used the ceasefire to consolidate their power, smuggle in weapons, and prepare for the next round. The Dutch, in particular, grew more and more impatient, convinced that the Republic was negotiating in bad faith. Their generals were chomping at the bit, convinced that one big, decisive military push could end this whole thing for good. The peace was already dead. It just hadn't been buried yet. The flimsy, universally disliked truce of the Lingga Agreement had a shelf life of about 5 minutes in the tropical heat. By the summer of 1947, both sides were openly accusing each other of cheating. The Dutch claimed the Republic was violating the ceasefire and smuggling weapons. The Republic claimed the Dutch were violating the spirit of the agreement by setting up puppet states in the outer islands and maintaining their crippling economic blockade. They were both right. The peace was a farce, and the Dutch hardliners, who had been saying "I told you so" since the moment it was signed, finally got their way. In mid-July, the Netherlands delivered a final insulting ultimatum to the Republic, demanding it effectively surrender all its political and military autonomy. The Republic, of course, refused. The time for talking, however insincerely, was over. On July 21, 1947, the Netherlands launched Operation Product. This was not a series of skirmishes. It was a massive, coordinated, multi-front military offensive. But here is where the Dutch pulled off a move of pure cynical genius. They didn't call it a war. They called it a politionele actie, a police action. This branding was crucial. You can't declare war on yourself. War is something that happens between two sovereign states. By calling it a police action, the Netherlands was telling the world, this is not an invasion. This is an internal security matter. We are the legitimate government here, and we are simply restoring law and order by apprehending a group of terrorists who are disrupting the peace. It was a brilliant piece of legal and political maneuvering designed to keep the rest of the world from getting involved. It was also a complete and utter fiction. The operation itself was a Dutch blitzkrieg. Their forces, equipped with modern American and British-made weaponry, supported by tanks, artillery, and an air force, smashed through the Republican lines. The Indonesian National Army, TNI, was a brave and resilient force, but it was largely made up of poorly trained and equipped soldiers who were no match for a professional European army in a conventional fight. The Dutch objectives were right there in the operation's name: product. This wasn't just about destroying the TNI, it was about seizing the economic heart of the country. In West Java, they stormed the capital, Batavia, and secured the surrounding region. In East Java, they captured the lucrative sugar-producing areas and the port of Surabaya. In Sumatra, their paratroopers dropped into Palembang to seize the oil refineries, while other columns advanced on the vast rubber and palm oil plantations. Militarily, it was an overwhelming success. In just a few weeks, the Dutch had achieved all their primary goals. They had conquered huge swathes of territory, shattered the TNI's conventional fighting ability, and seized the economic assets that were the lifeblood of the islands. The Republic's territory was drastically reduced to a landlocked rump state in central Java, with its government now huddled in the ancient royal city of Yogyakarta. On a map, it looked like the Dutch had won. But the Republic wasn't fighting a war for maps, it was fighting for survival. The TNI's commander-in-chief, the charismatic and fiercely determined General Suderman, knew they couldn't win a stand-up fight. So they didn't. Instead, they executed a classic guerrilla strategy of trading space for time. As the Dutch columns advanced, the TNI would fight brief holding actions and then melt away into the countryside, taking the local government administration with them. And as they retreated, they practiced a scorched earth policy, burning plantations, destroying factories, and blowing up bridges. Their message was simple: if we can't have these economic assets, neither can you. You wanted the product? Fine. Here are the ashes. The Republican Army didn't surrender. It dissolved into the population, ready to wage a long, brutal insurgency from the mountains and jungles. Personified dialogue setting, a frantic breaking news report on the fledgling global news network. Anchor: we're getting reports of a major military operation in the Dutch East Indies. We go now to our international correspondent. Correspondent: that's right, Brian. Dutch forces are advancing on all fronts. To get the official perspective, I have the Netherlands on the line. Netherlands, are you officially at war? Netherlands, in a calm, reassuring voice. War? Heavens no. Let's not be dramatic. This is a simple police action. We received reports of widespread disorder, extortion, and property damage, and we have dispatched our security forces to restore calm. It's a civic duty, really. Anchor: our reporters on the ground describe tanks, bombing raids, and tens of thousands of soldiers. That seems a bit more than a standard police operation. Netherlands: well, it's a very large jurisdiction, and the perpetrators were unusually rowdy. We believe in using the right tool for the job. But I want to assure the international community that our primary goal is to create a safe, stable, and prosperous environment for everyone, especially the sugar and rubber investors. Correspondent: the Republic of Indonesia is calling this a colonial war of reconquest. Netherlands sighs patiently. Yes, they're very creative with their slogans, but one can't invade a territory one already legally owns. That's just silly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go review the quarterly reports on our newly secured products. Herein lies the central folly of the Dutch strategy. The first police action is a perfect illustration of how to win a campaign and lose the war. On the battlefield, they were unstoppable. They got their plantations, their ports, and their oil fields. But in the court of global opinion, they had just set themselves on fire. By launching a massive invasion, no matter how they chose to brand it, they exposed their true intentions. They weren't interested in partnership or a negotiated settlement. They were interested in conquest. They were the old-school colonial power trying to bludgeon its rebellious subject back into submission. It's like trying to win an argument with your roommate by taking a sledgehammer to their bedroom door. You might get into the room, but the relationship is probably over, and now all the neighbors are staring at you. And in this case, the neighbors were the newly formed United Nations, and they were about to file a very serious noise complaint. So the Dutch have thrown their massive, violent house party. They've smashed the furniture, trashed the place, and are now standing victoriously on a pile of rubble, congratulating themselves on successfully restoring order. They control the ports, the plantations, and the major cities. On paper, it's a huge win. But their police action had been less of a quiet police matter, and more of a full-scale military rave with tanks for speakers and bombers for a light show. And when you make that much noise, the neighbors are going to complain. In this case, the neighbors were the entire world, and the complaint was being filed at the headquarters of the planet's brand new homeowners association, the United Nations. The UN was a young, idealistic, and slightly wobbly organization in 1947. Its entire reason for existing was to stop exactly this kind of thing. One country using military force to impose its will on another. The Dutch, of course, had a ready-made excuse. This isn't a country, it's our property. It's an internal affair. But two nations in particular were not buying it. The first was India, which had just achieved its own independence from Britain and was feeling very passionate about the whole anti-colonialism cause. Prime Minister Nehru saw the fight in Indonesia as the next chapter in the same book, and became one of the Republic's loudest champions. The second, and more surprising advocate was Australia. Geographically, Australia was right next door, and its government, along with its powerful unions, decided that a stable, independent Indonesia was a far better neighbor than a bitter, resentful, and perpetually unstable Dutch colony. Australian dockworkers famously refused to load and service Dutch ships bound for Indonesia, an act of solidarity known as the Black Armada. So in late July 1947, India and Australia formally brought the Indonesian question to the UN Security Council. This was a nightmare for the Netherlands. Their entire strategy depended on keeping this a private fight. Suddenly, they were being called into the principal's office. At the UN, the Dutch representative stood up and argued passionately that the Security Council had no jurisdiction. Citing Article 2, Paragraph 7 of the UN Charter, he declared this was a domestic issue, a simple police action, and the UN was legally forbidden from interfering. The Australian and Indian representatives shot back that a conflict involving tanks, planes, and two massive armies was, by any reasonable definition, a threat to international peace, and therefore exactly the Security Council's business. The debate put the major world powers in an awkward spot. The Soviet Union naturally had a field day. They loudly condemned the Dutch as imperialist aggressors and championed the Indonesian cause, not because they cared about democracy in Jakarta, but because it was a golden opportunity to make the West look bad. This, in turn, made the United States deeply uncomfortable. On one hand, the US was ideologically anti-colonial. On the other hand, the Cold War was just getting started, and the Netherlands was a vital part of the anti-Soviet bloc in Europe. Washington needed the Dutch on their side for the Marshall Plan and the future NATO. They were the rich guy at the HOA meeting who really disapproves of his friend's loud party, but also needs to borrow his lawnmower next week. So the US waffled, urging restraint on both sides. But the sheer undeniable scale of the Dutch military operation was too much to ignore. On August 1, 1947, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 27. It was a fairly toothless resolution. It didn't condemn the Dutch or impose sanctions, but it did one world-changing thing. It called upon both parties to cease hostilities immediately and settle their dispute through mediation. Both parties. With those two words, the United Nations had implicitly placed the battered, half-conquered Republic of Indonesia on the same diplomatic footing as the Kingdom of the Netherlands. For the Dutch, this was a catastrophic diplomatic defeat. Their legal fiction of an internal affair had been shattered. The world now saw two legitimate combatants. To facilitate the mediation, the UN created a Committee of Good Offices, CGO. It was a three-member team, one country chosen by Indonesia, one by the Netherlands, and a third chosen by those two. Indonesia chose Australia, its biggest cheerleader. The Netherlands chose Belgium, its next-door neighbor and fellow colonial power. And for the third neutral member, they settled on the United States. A trio of diplomats from these three nations was now tasked with flying into a war zone and trying to get the two sides to start talking again. Personified dialogue setting, the UN Security Council chamber, reimagined as a very tense parent-teacher conference, and the principal. Thank you for coming in, Netherlands. We've had some complaints. Australia and India here are very concerned about the level of disciplinary action you've been taking in your East Indies class. Netherlands, stiffly. It's a police action, not a disciplinary action, and it's my classroom. The charter clearly states that you have no say in how I manage my own students. Australia. You drove a tank through the gymnasium. We think that's a bit much. Soviet Union, from the back of the room, loudly, is typical example of corrupt, imperialist educational methods. The students must be liberated. USA, the school counselor, leaning over to the Netherlands. Look, I get it, you're old school, but the optics here are terrible. The whole school board is watching. Just agree to a timeout, please. It'll make my life so much easier. We still need your support on the annual budget, remember? UN, the principal, bangs gavel. That's enough. It is the decision of this council that you and the rebellious student council will enter mediation. The school counselors from Australia, Belgium, and the US will oversee it. Now stop the fighting, immediately. The Dutch had won their police action so decisively on the ground that they had lost everything in the airwaves. Their military brilliance had been overshadowed by their political deafness. They had failed to realize that the rules of the game had changed. In the 19th century, you could launch a colonial war and no one would bat an eye. But in the brand new post-war world of 1947, with a global institution designed specifically to prevent such things, their actions looked like a brutish anachronism. They had tried to handle a breakup by kicking down the door, and in doing so they had turned their private dispute into a public spectacle. The international community was now officially invested. The UN was sending mediators. The Dutch reluctantly agreed to a ceasefire along the so-called Van Mook line, which was basically just a line drawn on the map where their tanks had run out of gas. The fighting died down, but the conflict was far from over. The next round of couples counseling was about to begin, and it was going to be held on a boat. So the UN has banged on the wall and told the Netherlands and Indonesia to keep it down. The ceasefire is more or less holding, and the three-nation Committee of Good Offices, Australia, Belgium, and the USA, has arrived in the archipelago, ready to do some mediating. Their first task, find a place to talk. This immediately devolved into a farce. The Dutch magnanimously offered their capital, Batavia, a city they had just reconquered by force. The Republic naturally told them to get stuffed and insisted the talks be held in their capital, Yogyakarta. Neither side would budge. It was a childish standoff, but it was dripping with symbolism. To go to Batavia would be to tacitly accept Dutch authority. To go to Yogyakarta would be to recognize the Republic. The mediators were stuck. How do you hold peace talks when you can't even agree on a room? Enter the United States with a solution that is so perfectly American it deserves a salute. Can't agree on a venue on land? Fine. We'll bring our own venue. They offered up the USS Renville, a drab, gray, entirely unglamorous naval transport ship, anchored in the neutral waters of Batavia Bay. And so began one of the strangest diplomatic summits in history, with the fate of a nation being decided not in a gilded palace but in the mess hall of a military vessel, probably smelling faintly of diesel fuel and boiled cabbage. It was the geopolitical equivalent of your parents making you and your siblings sort out your differences in the back of the station wagon. The talks aboard the Renville dragged on from December 1947 into January 1948, and the atmosphere was toxic. The Dutch delegation, flush with their recent military victory, was arrogant and unyielding. The Republican delegation was negotiating from a position of profound weakness. They had lost their best territory, their army was scattered, and their people were suffering under a crushing Dutch blockade. The Committee of Good Offices wasn't there to arbitrate or impose a settlement. Their mandate was just to provide good offices, to facilitate, suggest, and gently persuade. But the American representative, with the weight of a superpower behind him, did most of the persuading. And his main goal was to achieve stability. And stability in the early Cold War often meant getting the weaker party to accept the unpleasant facts on the ground. What emerged from this maritime mediation was the Renville Agreement, a document that made the already unpopular Linggadjati Agreement look like a stunning diplomatic triumph. For the Republic of Indonesia, it was a disaster. First, it formalized a ceasefire along the Van Mook Line, the furthest point of the Dutch advance during Operation Product. This meant the Republic had to officially recognize the loss of huge, vital chunks of Java and Sumatra. Worse, they had to order the 35,000 Republican guerrilla fighters still operating behind that line to either surrender or withdraw into the Republic's tiny remaining territory. This was a militarily devastating and psychologically crushing blow. Second, the Republic was once again forced to agree to the Dutch plan for a federal United States of Indonesia, in which they would be just one of many states. The dream of a strong, unitary republic was officially sacrificed on the altar of a realistic compromise. Third, and this was the tiny wilted carrot offered to the Indonesians, the Dutch promised to hold plebiscites, popular votes, in the territories they now controlled to allow the people there to decide if they wanted to join the republic or form their own separate states within the federation. It was a flimsy promise of future self-determination that everyone knew the Dutch would rig, but it was the only concession the Republic could get. Personified dialogue setting, a cramped cabin on the USS Renville, USA, wearing a Hawaiian shirt over his naval uniform, is trying to close the deal. USA: all right people, listen up. The skipper wants his boat back, and I want a steak. We're signing this thing today. Indonesia: I know you're not happy. Indonesia: happy? You're asking me to sign away my body parts to get a promise of a get-well-soon card. This isn't a treaty. It's a mugging, say. Look at it as a strategic pause. You're on the ropes. This deal lets you stay in the ring. You sign, the blockade eases up, and you live to fight another day. It's the best deal you're gonna get. Netherlands, polishing his monocle. Indeed, a most generous deal, I thought. We are allowing them to exist at all, which is quite charitable. USA turns to the Netherlands. And you, don't get too smug. You're promising a vote, a fair vote. The world is watching. My State Department is watching. So when you hold this plebiscite, you at least have to look like you're not holding a gun to everyone's head, got it? Netherlands, smiling. Of course, the integrity of the ballot box is paramount. The ballots will be counted with the utmost care by my officials, in my offices, under the protection of my army. Perfectly democratic. Indonesia, sighs, picks up the pen. Fine, but when this all blows up again, don't say I didn't warn you. The Renville Agreement is a brutal lesson in the reality of power politics. It was a document born not of justice or principle, but of military leverage. The Republic of Indonesia was forced to sign because it had lost the last round, and the referee, the United States, was more interested in ending the fight than in who started it or who was right. The American priority was to prevent the chaos in Indonesia from becoming a vacuum that communism could fill. A stable, Dutch-affiliated federal state seemed like a much safer bet than a radical, unpredictable, and potentially leftist unitary republic. It was the Cold War logic of choosing the devil you know for the ideals of self-determination that the U.S. supposedly championed. It was a moment of profound compromise. The agreement was signed in January 1948. The Dutch were thrilled. They had their military gains legitimized by an international agreement and had forced the republic into their federal framework. For the Indonesian side, it was a moment of national humiliation. When the terms were made public, The Republican government that signed it, led by Prime Minister Amir Sharifuddin, was immediately forced to resign in disgrace. The Republic was now a shadow of its former self, a small, landlocked statelet in central Java, seemingly at the mercy of the Dutch. The Dutch military and political leaders were confident that they had, at last, broken the back of the revolution. They believed the end was in sight. They were, of course, catastrophically wrong. Just when you thought things couldn't possibly get worse for the Republic of Indonesia, they did. After the national humiliation of the Renville Agreement, the Republic was on its knees. Its territory was tiny, its economy was strangled, and its government was seen as weak and ineffective. Morale was at an all-time low, and into this toxic stew of desperation and political infighting walked a ghost from the past. A man named Musso, a veteran Indonesian communist who had spent the last 2 decades in exile in the Soviet Union. He arrived back in Indonesia in August 1948 with a briefcase full of Stalinist doctrine and a burning conviction that the Indonesian Revolution had been betrayed by its weak bourgeois leaders, Sukarno and Hatta. Musso was a hardcore old-school revolutionary. He looked at the endless, fruitless negotiations with the Dutch and saw nothing but capitulation. To him, the Renville Agreement wasn't a strategic retreat, it was a pathetic surrender. He quickly took charge of the fractious Indonesian Communist Party, PKI, and its affiliated leftist groups, uniting them under a new, fiery banner. His message was simple and seductive. The revolution has been hijacked. Sukarno and Hatta are selling you out to the Dutch imperialists and their American masters. It's time for a real revolution, a workers' revolution, to sweep away these compromisers and establish a true people's republic. This was a nightmare scenario for the Republican government. It's one thing to fight the enemy at your gates. It is another thing entirely when your own cousin tries to burn the house down from the inside while you were doing it. The Dutch watched this development with undisguised glee, rubbing their hands together and waiting for the Republic to conveniently self-destruct. In September 1948, Musso's plan went into action. In the East Javan city of Madiun, pro-PKI military units and armed militias staged a coup. They seized control of the city, murdered pro-government officers and officials, and proudly announced the formation of a new revolutionary government. The Madiun affair had begun. The Republic was now fighting a war on 2 fronts. This was the ultimate moment of crisis. The government in Yogyakarta had a choice to make, and it had to make it fast. Sukarno, in a stroke of political genius, realized this wasn't a fight that could be won with quiet backroom deals. It had to be won in the court of public opinion. He went on national radio and delivered a speech that would go down in Indonesian history. He didn't bother with complicated ideological arguments. He simplified the entire national crisis into one stark, personal choice. He asked the people of Indonesia to choose a side, not a platform. His voice crackling with emotion, he famously declared, "Ikut Musso dengan PKI-nya, atau ikut Sukarno-Hatta, follow Musso with his Communist Party, or follow Sukarno-Hatta." It was a brilliant gamble, and it worked. The vast majority of the Indonesian people and, more importantly, the Indonesian military, threw their lot in with the established familiar leadership of the Republic. The government then made a brutal but necessary strategic decision. They ordered their most loyal and battle-hardened troops, the elite Siliwangi Division, to disengage from the Dutch front lines. Their new target was not the Colonial Army, but their own countrymen in Madiun. The Republic turned its guns inward. The ensuing fight was short, sharp, and merciless. Within weeks, the rebellion was crushed. Madiun was retaken. Thousands of PKI members and sympathizers were rounded up and executed, and Musso himself was cornered and killed, while, as the official report dryly stated, resisting arrest. Personified dialogue setting, a frantic 3-way telephone call between major world powers. USA, on the line with Netherlands. Okay, so what's the latest? My intel says the Republic is about to implode. Is the communist takeover happening? Netherlands, smugly. It certainly looks that way. We're just sitting back and watching the show. Told you they weren't fit to govern. Full of radicals. Once they've bled each other dry, we'll move in to restore stability. A new voice, the PKI, cuts into the line with a burst of static. PKI, death to the running dogs of imperialism. The Madian Soviet is the true heart of the revolution. All power to the people. USA, panicked. Oh God, it's happening. This is my worst nightmare. This whole region is going to turn red. Suddenly, the PKI line goes dead with a sharp crack. The calm voice of Indonesia's government comes on the line. Indonesia. Apologies for the interruption. We were just taking out the trash. Now where were we? USA. Stunned silence. Did you just? Indonesia. We have dealt with our internal communist problem. Decisively. Unlike some other countries in Asia I could mention. We believe in a free, independent, and non-communist Indonesia. Just thought you should know. Netherlands. Muttering. Well, shoot. That wasn't supposed to happen. And here we stumble upon one of the greatest and most tragic ironies of the entire Indonesian revolution. The Madian affair, a bloody and traumatic civil war, was the best thing that could have possibly happened for the Republic's international standing. By ruthlessly crushing a Soviet-backed communist uprising with their own troops, without any outside help, Sukarno and Hatta sent the clearest possible signal to a paranoid, Cold War-obsessed Washington, D.C. The message was unmistakable. We are not communists. In fact, we are your most effective anti-communist partner in Southeast Asia. This single act did more to win American sympathy than 1,000 diplomatic communiques ever could. It reframed the entire conflict. The U.S. State Department began to see that the choice wasn't between a stable Dutch colony and a chaotic, potentially communist republic. The choice was between a failing Dutch colonial war that was breeding extremism and a stable, nationalist, and proven anti-communist republic. The republic had survived its darkest hour by turning on itself. It was a brutal act of political consolidation, but it reshaped the entire geopolitical landscape. The Dutch, who had been hoping for an easy win through their enemy's self-destruction, were now left looking like the destabilizing force in the region. Their clock was ticking. They knew the shifting winds of American policy could soon blow against them. They decided they had time for one last roll of the dice, one final, massive military blow to decapitate the Republic before the rest of the world could stop them. The Republic of Indonesia's successful, brutal takedown of the Madiun communists was a political masterstroke, but it left the Dutch in a foul mood. Their secret hope that the Republic would tear itself apart in a civil war had been dashed. Even worse, the Americans were now looking at Sukarno's government with a newfound grudging respect. The diplomatic clock was ticking against the Netherlands. Their military and political hardliners decided that the time for subtlety, not that they had ever really tried it, was over. The Renville Agreement was a sham, the ceasefire was a joke, and the endless negotiations were getting them nowhere. It was time for a knockout blow. It was time to end this once and for all. Their plan was simple, audacious, and profoundly stupid. They would cut the head off the snake. On December 19, 1948, without a formal declaration or warning, the Netherlands tore up the Renville Agreement and launched Operation Crow. This was the second police action, and its objective was not economic, but political. They weren't trying to capture plantations, they were trying to capture a government. The target was the Republic's heart and brain, the temporary capital city of Yogyakarta. At dawn, Dutch transport planes appeared in the skies over the city, dropping hundreds of paratroopers onto the nearby Maguwo airfield. The surprise was total. The Dutch commandos swiftly seized the airfield and cleared the way for reinforcements to be flown in. Within hours, a powerful mechanized Dutch column was racing from the airfield into the heart of Yogyakarta. The city's defenses were overwhelmed in a matter of hours. Inside the presidential palace, the Republican leadership faced a fateful choice. The sounds of battle were getting closer by the minute. They could flee, join the army in the mountains, and become a government in exile in their own country, or they could stay. Sukarno, Hatta, and most of the cabinet made a calculated, courageous, and politically brilliant decision. They would stay and be captured. They calmly burned sensitive documents, put on their best suits, and waited for the Dutch soldiers to arrive. This was not an act of surrender. It was an act of political theater. By allowing themselves to be arrested, they were transforming themselves from combatants into martyrs. They knew that images of the legitimate president and vice president of a republic being taken into custody by a colonial army would be a diplomatic atomic bomb. They weren't just letting themselves be captured, they were weaponizing their own arrests. By the afternoon, it was all over. The Dutch had them. President Sukarno, Vice President Hatta, Prime Minister Scharier, the entire civilian leadership of the Republic was rounded up and put on a plane to be exiled to a remote island. The Dutch command was jubilant. They had done it. In a single, flawlessly executed military operation, they had decapitated the entire revolution. They immediately sent out triumphant press releases to the rest of the world. The so-called Republic of Indonesia has ceased to exist. Its leaders are our prisoners. The trouble is over. The war is won. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had confused the government with the nation, the statesmen with the struggle, and in their haste to grab the politicians, they had missed the single most important military figure in the country. While the Dutch were posing for photos at the palace, General Suderman, the revered commander-in-chief of the TNI, was making his escape. Suderman was a walking symbol of the revolution's unbreakable will. He was terminally ill with tuberculosis, so weak that he had to be carried everywhere on a simple bamboo litter, and possessed only one functioning lung. But from that litter, he commanded the absolute loyalty of his army. As the Dutch swarmed the city, a small group of his elite guards carried the ailing general out of a back gate and melted into the Javanese countryside. The Dutch had captured the Republic's voice, but they had let its sword slip through their fingers. Personified dialogue. Setting: a metaphorical operating room. The Netherlands, dressed as a surgeon, has just finished a procedure on the patient, Indonesia. The USA is observing. Netherlands wipes his brow, looking triumphant. There, the surgery was a complete success. I have excised the Republican tumor from the body politic. The patient's capital has been removed. The entire leadership structure is in this jar. The war is over. USA, are you sure? It looks like you've made a rather large, angry incision, and the patient is still, fighting the nurses. Netherlands, those are just post-operative spasms, insignificant. Once they realize their head is gone, the rest of the body will cease to function. It's simple biology. Indonesia's immune system, General Suderman's voice echoing from offstage. The government has been captured, but the Republic is not the government. The Republic is the army. The Republic is the people. The war has just begun. USA, looking nervously at the monitors, which are flashing red. Surgeon, I don't think that was a tumor. I think you just tried to remove the patient's heart, and now their immune system has declared total war on you. This is going to get messy. Operation Crow is a masterclass in the art of winning a battle so brilliantly that you ensure you lose the war. Tactically, it was perfect. Strategically, it was an act of political suicide. The Dutch thought the Republic was a pyramid, and if you knocked off the top, the whole thing would collapse. But they were wrong. The Republic wasn't a pyramid, it was a swamp. It was a decentralized, popular resistance movement. By capturing the government, the Dutch hadn't ended the revolution. They had just made it angrier, and removed the one group of people, the diplomats and politicians, who might have been able to negotiate a ceasefire. And by exiling Sukarno, they transformed him from a local politician into a global icon of anti-colonial struggle. The Dutch thought their victory in Yogyakarta was the end of the story. But in the jungles and mountains of Java, a sick man on a stretcher was sending out a message that would electrify the archipelago. The civilian government had fallen, but a new military high command was in charge. The war would now be fought not for cities or palaces, but for every village, every road, every rice paddy. The Dutch hadn't just reignited the war. They had poured gasoline on it and thrown in a crate of dynamite for good measure. The Dutch were feeling pretty good about themselves. They'd pulled off their daring heist, captured the entire Republican government, and were now the undisputed masters of Yogyakarta. In their minds, the game was over. They'd won. But a funny thing was happening out in the countryside. An eerie silence had fallen. The Indonesian army, the TNI, which they had expected to either surrender or be mopped up, had simply vanished. It was as if thousands of soldiers had evaporated into the jungle mist. The Dutch had decapitated the Republic, but they were about to learn that they had created a ghost, and that ghost was going to haunt them relentlessly. From his litter, being carried through the dense Javanese jungle, the ailing General Sudirman issued his first command of this new war, Perintah Siasat Number 1. It was the order that officially transformed the conflict. The new strategy was called Perang Rakyat Semesta, the Total People's War. The concept was as simple as it was brilliant. The TNI would cease to be a conventional army. It would no longer try to hold cities or defend front lines. Instead, the army would dissolve itself into the civilian population. Every village was now a hidden barracks. Every farmer was a potential intelligence agent. Every jungle path was a potential supply line. The army and the people were one. The goal was no longer to defeat the Dutch army in a pitched battle. That was impossible. The new goal was to make the Dutch occupation so costly, so frustrating, and so terrifying that the Netherlands would simply give up and go home. This was a whole new ball game, and the Dutch were not equipped to play it. Their entire military machine was designed to fight an enemy they could see. But how do you fight an enemy that looks just like the local farmer selling you bananas in the morning, and then plants a mine on the road that afternoon? The Dutch controlled the cities and the main roads, but only during daylight hours. At night, the Republic owned the countryside. TNI guerrilla units would emerge from the darkness to ambush Dutch patrols, sabotage railways, attack isolated plantations, and then melt back into the population by sunrise. To make the resistance even more resilient, the Republic had implemented an organizational structure called the Wehrkreise system, a fancy German term for military districts. Java and Sumatra were carved up into a series of self-sufficient command zones. Each local commander had complete autonomy to wage war as they saw fit, without needing orders from a central headquarters that no longer existed. This decentralized structure made the revolution impossible to kill. The Dutch could launch a major operation and wipe out a guerrilla band in one district, but it had zero effect on the district next door, which would continue fighting as if nothing had happened. It was a hydra-headed resistance. For every head the Dutch cut off, 2 more seemed to grow back. For the average Dutch soldier, this was a counterinsurgency nightmare. They were an army of occupation in a country of 80 million people who hated their guts. They were surrounded by a hostile population where it was impossible to tell friend from foe. Their enemy was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Morale began to plummet. The war became an endless, draining series of patrols, guard duties, and sudden, terrifying ambushes. It was a war against ghosts, and it was bleeding the Dutch treasury dry. Personified dialogue setting. A Dutch military field office. A weary Dutch general is on the phone with a politician back in The Hague. Politician, on phone. General, excellent work on capturing Yogyakarta. The papers here are calling it a triumph. So, when can we expect the full pacification of the island? General, sighs, pours himself a large gin. Pacification? Sir, with all due respect, you can't pacify a plague of locusts. We control the cities, we control the asphalt. But the moment you step off the main road, you're not in the Netherlands Indies anymore. You're in the Republic of Indonesia. Politician, but we have their leaders. We've won the war. General, we've won a battle. The war has just changed. We're not fighting an army now. We're fighting the entire damn population. My men secure a bridge and the next day it's blown up. We clear a village of insurgents and the next week they're back. We're not an army. We're the world's most expensive and heavily armed repair crew, and we are losing equipment and men every single day to an enemy we can't find. Politician, just find their new headquarters and destroy it. General, sir, their headquarters is a sick man on a stretcher being carried through a jungle. Their headquarters is in the heart of every single person on this island. How in God's name am I supposed to conquer that? This is the timeless, tragic asymmetry of guerrilla warfare, a lesson that powerful empires have to learn the hard way, over and over again, throughout history. The Dutch came to Indonesia with a 20th century army, but the TNI forced them to fight an 18th century war of 1,000 cuts. The Dutch were trying to win by conquering territory and killing enemy soldiers. The Indonesians were trying to win by simply not surrendering. And in that kind of war, the side with the greater willpower, not the greater firepower, usually wins. The Dutch could kill thousands of Indonesian fighters, but they couldn't kill the idea of Indonesia itself. They were stuck in a quagmire of their own making, a war they couldn't win, couldn't afford, and didn't know how to end. Their brilliant knockout blow in Yogyakarta had failed to knock the Republic out. Instead, it had forced the revolution to evolve into a leaner, meaner, and far more effective fighting force. The Dutch thought they had the situation under control, but they were about to get another nasty surprise. It turned out that the captured leaders in Yogyakarta had a contingency plan, a secret ace up their sleeve that was about to be played. The Dutch military was now stuck in its self-made quagmire, fighting a frustrating and unwinnable war against the ghosts of the TNI. But through it all, they clung to one single, comforting fact that formed the entire basis of their international argument. They had the government. The Republic of Indonesia as a political entity was dead because its entire leadership was sitting in a Dutch jail. They repeated this line over and over at the UN. There is no one to negotiate with. The Republic has ceased to exist. This was their triumphant checkmate. The only problem was, they were about to discover that their opponent had a secret queen hidden on the other side of the board. What the Dutch didn't know or had fatally underestimated was that the Republican leaders were not amateurs. In the frantic hours before the Dutch stormed the palace in Yogyakarta, Sukarno and Hatta had been busy enacting a brilliant, in case of emergency, break-glass contingency plan. They had sent out a series of urgent coded telegrams. The first telegram went to Syafruddin Praviranegara, their Minister of Welfare, who happened to be on official business in the highlands of Sumatra. The instructions were simple. If you hear that we have been captured, you are hereby authorized and instructed to form an emergency government in Sumatra. This was Plan A. The second telegram went to their diplomats in New Delhi, India, with even more stark instructions. If you hear that Plan A has failed and Syafruddin has also been captured, you are to form a formal government in exile in India. This was Plan B. They were not going to let the Republic die with them. Plan A worked perfectly. Syafruddin received the message. He, along with a few other Republican officials, retreated deep into the Sumatran jungle near the town of Bukit Tinggi. There, surrounded by mountains and protected by local TNI units, they officially established the Pemerintahan Darurat Republik Indonesia, PDRI, or the Emergency Government of the Republic of Indonesia. Out of makeshift huts, with a radio transmitter powered by a bicycle pedal generator, the PDRI began broadcasting to the world. Their message was simple. Reports of our death have been greatly exaggerated. The president may be a prisoner, but the presidency is here. The government is safe. The republic lives on. The creation of the PDRI was a move of pure political genius that completely demolished the Dutch strategy. The entire Dutch argument at the UN rested on the idea that they had created a power vacuum that only they could fill. The PDRI proved this was a lie. There was no vacuum. There was a clear, legitimate line of succession. The Republic wasn't just a collection of charismatic men. It was a functioning state with a constitution and protocols for just such an emergency. The PDRI provided the crucial element of governmental continuity. It was the vital link connecting the military struggle, led by General Sudirman in Java, with the diplomatic struggle being fought by their representatives at the UN in New York. While Sudirman's guerrillas were blowing up Dutch bridges, the PDRI was sending instructions to their diplomats, drafting political statements, and acting as the sovereign authority of the nation. For the Dutch, this was infuriating. It was like they had gone through all the trouble of staging an elaborate corporate takeover, forcibly removing the entire board of directors, only to find out that the board had pre-authorized a junior vice president in a branch office 1,000 miles away to take over the entire company. Their decapitation strike had failed because the Republic had more than one head. Their checkmate was not a checkmate. It was an illegal move in a game whose rules they did not understand. Personified dialogue setting, a formal session at the United Nations. The Netherlands is at the podium, trying to look authoritative. Netherlands. And so, as I have explained, with the former leaders of the so-called Republic now in our protective custody, there is no longer a functioning government. The entity has collapsed. We, the Netherlands, are the only legitimate authority, and we are working to restore order. An aide rushes up to the Australian delegate and hands him a piece of paper. The Australian delegate smiles. Australia. A point of order, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to read a telegram we've received, broadcast just this morning from a radio station in Sumatra. It begins, a proclamation from the desk of the acting president of the Republic of Indonesia, Syafruddin Prawiranegara. It seems your defunct government is busy passing legislation. Netherlands. Goes pale. That's a fabrication. Propaganda. They are bandits in the jungle, not a government. India. Bandits with a cabinet, a constitutionally appointed leader, and the loyalty of the army, it seems. We consider them the legitimate government of Indonesia. USA, leaning back and whispering to his aide. Okay, this is getting embarrassing for them. They captured the wrong guys. Or, rather, they didn't capture enough guys. Remind me to update our analysis. The Dutch don't have this under control, at all. This is the moment you can see the Dutch colonial project truly beginning to die, not with a bang, but with the crackle of a distant radio broadcast. They had made the classic colonizers' mistake. They had underestimated their opponent. They saw the Indonesians as emotional, disorganized radicals, incapable of the kind of foresight and sophisticated planning that leads to contingency plans and emergency governments. They believed their own propaganda. But the Indonesian leaders had proven that they were not just rebels. They were statesmen, capable of thinking several moves ahead. They understood that the war would be won not just by bullets in the jungle, but by legitimacy at the UN. The Dutch were now in an impossible position. They were fighting a guerrilla war they couldn't win against Suderman's army. They were facing growing international condemnation for their aggression, and their core political argument, that the Republic was dead, had just been proven false by a handful of men with a bicycle-powered radio in the middle of the Sumatran rainforest. The board was reset. The Indonesian resistance, with a fully functioning military command and a fully functioning emergency government, was about to make its next move, a bold, symbolic strike designed to prove to the whole world who really controlled Indonesia. The Dutch were now in a truly miserable spot. Their grand military adventure had devolved into a nightmarish game of whack-a-mole against an invisible army. Their brilliant political strategy of capturing the government had been foiled by a backup government hiding in the jungle. And the whole time they had to keep showing up at the UN, smiling politely and assuring everyone that everything was totally, completely under control. The situation is pacified, they insisted. The TNI is just a disorganized rabble on the verge of collapse. The Indonesian resistance, both the military command in Java and the emergency government in Sumatra, decided it was time to prove, in the most dramatic way imaginable, that this was a lie. They needed a showstopper, a big, bold, symbolic gesture that the whole world would have to notice. The plan was audacious. It was a military operation conceived as a piece of political theater. Think of it as a legendary rock band planning a surprise comeback tour with only one date, for one night only. The venue? Their old home stadium, which was now occupied by their bitter rivals. The goal wasn't to take the stadium back for good. The goal was to sneak in, set up the stage, play a face-melting 6-hour set of their greatest hits, and get out before the authorities could shut them down, all just to prove to the world that they were still the biggest band in the land. The stadium was the captured capital, Yogyakarta. The band was the TNI. And the concert promoter, the man in charge of the local arrangements, was an ambitious and cunning lieutenant colonel named Suharto. The plan was called the Serangan Oimoem Warmaret 1949, the General Offensive of March 1, 1949. In the weeks leading up to it, thousands of TNI soldiers, dressed as simple farmers and merchants, began secretly infiltrating Yogyakarta. They slipped past Dutch patrols, hid weapons in the homes of sympathetic citizens, and quietly moved into position, waiting. The Dutch garrison in the city felt secure, blissfully unaware that they were sleeping in the middle of an enemy army. The signal was the public city siren at 6 a.m. on March 1st. For the Dutch, the siren meant the morning curfew was over and the city was waking up. For the TNI, it was the opening chord. The moment the siren wailed, all hell broke loose. The hidden guerrilla cells inside the city erupted into action, attacking Dutch posts and patrols. Simultaneously, larger TNI forces that had gathered in the surrounding countryside launched a coordinated assault from all sides. The Dutch were caught completely and totally by surprise. They were fighting enemies who were popping out of houses, alleys, and sewers. Within a few short, bloody hours, the unthinkable happened. The TNI overwhelmed the Dutch defenses and seized control of the center of Yogyakarta. As the sun rose higher, the red and white flag of the Republic of Indonesia was once again flying over its captive capital. But holding the city was never the point. The point was the performance. They held it for 6 hours, just long enough. Long enough for the stunned citizens of Yogyakarta to see the Republican army marching through their streets, to feel a jolt of hope, and to have their morale restored. Long enough for the news to be relayed to the PDRI's secret radio transmitters and broadcast across the archipelago into the rest of the world. And most crucially, long enough for the UN military observers stationed in Java to witness the battle with their own eyes and file an official report. The TNI knew exactly what it was doing. This wasn't just a battle, it was an evidence-gathering exercise for the UN. Then, around noon, just as the Dutch were beginning to organize a major counterattack with heavy reinforcements, the TNI did what it did best. They vanished. They slipped back out of the city, melting into the countryside, leaving behind a bewildered and deeply humiliated Dutch military. The concert was over. Personified dialogue setting. A briefing room at the U.S. State Department. A senior official is being updated by an analyst. Official. So what's the latest on the Dutch situation in Indonesia? Their ambassador was just in here yesterday assuring me they have full control of Java. Analyst. Slides a telegram across the desk. Sir, you need to see this. It's a flash cable from our UN observer on the ground. At 6 a.m. this morning, the TNI launched a multi-pronged, division-sized attack and captured the center of Yogyakarta. Official. Captured it? You mean they attacked it? Analyst. No, sir. Captured. They held it for 6 hours, raised their flag, paraded through the streets the whole 9 yards. Then they just left. The Dutch only regained control of the city center after the TNI had apparently finished whatever it was they were doing. Official. Stares at the telegram, his face hardening. So the Dutch ambassador lied directly to my face. They don't have control. They don't even know what's happening in their own capital. They're losing and they're wasting our money doing it. Analyst. It would appear so, sir. Diplomatically speaking, the Indonesians just dropped a bomb on The Hague from 1,000 miles away. Official. Get the Secretary of State on the phone, and then get me the Dutch ambassador. I think it's time we had a very frank conversation about the future of the Marshall Plan. The meta-commentary here is about the changing nature of warfare in the 20th century. The general offensive was a military operation, where the primary targets were not enemy soldiers, but newspaper headlines and diplomatic reports. The TNI leadership, particularly the Sultan of Yogyakarta who helped plan the attack, understood that they couldn't beat the Dutch army, but they could beat the Dutch argument. The 6-hour seizure of the city was the most powerful, irrefutable piece of evidence they could present to the world. It was a live-action refutation of Dutch propaganda. Every shot fired was a sentence in a diplomatic cable. Every street captured was a paragraph in a UN report. In 6 hours, they didn't win a war, but they won the story. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. The shockwaves from this perfectly executed piece of military theater would be felt all the way from the halls of the UN to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. The Dutch were about to get a very angry call from their sponsor. The general offensive of March 1st was the stone that started an avalanche. News of the audacious 6-hour capture of Yogyakarta spread like wildfire through the world as diplomatic channels, and it landed with a deafening thud on a desk in Washington, D.C. For years, the United States had been playing a frustrating double game. On one hand, they were the world's first successful anti-colonial rebels, and the idea of empire left a bad taste in their mouth. On the other hand, the Netherlands was their crucial frontline European ally in the brand new, terrifying Cold War against the Soviet Union. So they had waffled, urging moderation and negotiation while simultaneously funding the Dutch recovery. But the events of late 1948 and early 1949 finally broke America's patience. The Dutch had crossed a line. First, they had lied. Dutch diplomats had repeatedly assured the State Department that they had the situation under control and that the Indonesian army was a spent force. The attack on Yogyakarta proved this was a fantasy. The U.S. does not like being lied to, especially when it's being made to look foolish on the world stage. Second, this endless bloody war was destabilizing the exact region the U.S. wanted to build up as a stable, capitalist bulwark against the spread of communism in Asia. The Dutch weren't solving a problem. They were creating a power vacuum that radicals could exploit. And third, and this was the big one, the war was costing a fortune. Enter the Marshall Plan. This was America's colossal, multi-billion-dollar aid package to rebuild a shattered Western Europe after World War II. The Netherlands, having been wrecked by the Nazi occupation, was a major recipient. Their entire economic recovery, from rebuilding the port of Rotterdam to stabilizing their currency, was floating on a sea of American dollars. And now, members of the U.S. Congress and the American public were starting to ask a very awkward question. Why are we pouring our taxpayer money into rebuilding the Netherlands if the Netherlands is just pouring that money into a black hole of a colonial war on the other side of the world? The Marshall Plan was meant to build houses in Amsterdam, not fund bombing raids in Java. The pressure mounted. Influential U.S. senators threatened to pass legislation specifically blocking aid to any country using it to fund a colonial reconquest. The second Dutch police action was the last straw. The Truman administration, which had been prodding the Dutch behind the scenes, now took off the velvet gloves. The diplomatic messages sent from Washington to The Hague became less like suggestions and more like threats. The message was delivered with the cold, hard clarity of a bank manager calling in a loan. They made it clear that if the Netherlands did not cease hostilities, release the captured Republican leaders, and return to negotiations with the express purpose of granting Indonesia its independence, the Marshall Plan money would be suspended. For the Netherlands, this was a death blow. They were trapped. On one side was their national pride, their sense of imperial destiny and 350 years of history that told them Indonesia was theirs. On the other side was the catastrophic immediate prospect of total national bankruptcy. Losing Indonesia would be a slow, painful amputation. Losing American aid would be a gunshot to the head. They had no choice. Their bluff had been called by the one country in the world that held all the cards. Personified dialogue setting, a very tense one-way transatlantic phone call. The USA is sitting at a large desk. The Netherlands is on the other end, listening in horrified silence. USA, Netherlands, it's America. We're done. I'm looking at your file here. You told me your second police action would be a quick, decisive end to the problem. Instead, you're stuck in a guerrilla war you can't win. You've turned Sukarno into a global celebrity and you made me look like an idiot at the UN. This partnership is no longer working for me. Netherlands, stammering, but the communists. We are fighting the spread of communism. USA. No, they are fighting the communists. They proved that at Madian. You, my friend, are fighting the spread of nationalism, which is a war you can't win. And you're doing it with my money. The money I gave you to fix your dikes and rebuild your factories. My Congress is furious. They think I'm funding your gambling addiction. Netherlands. It is a matter of national honor. USA. Honor doesn't pay the bills. The Marshall Plan does. And the payments stop unless I see Sukarno and his friends out of jail and sitting at a negotiating table within the next few weeks. And this time, you're not going to be discussing the terms of their surrender. You're going to be discussing the terms of yours. It's over. Let it go. The USA hangs up, leaving the Netherlands holding a dead phone and the wreckage of an empire. And this is the cold, hard truth at the heart of the post-war world. The age of the great European empires was over, not just because of the force of nationalism, but because the economic center of the world had shifted. The old empires were now broke, and they were dependent on a new superpower that had little sentimental attachment to their colonial past. The Netherlands had been fighting a 20th century war with a 19th century mindset, fueled by 18th century ideas of imperial glory. But the whole enterprise was underwritten by a mid-20th century American bank loan, and the bank was finally foreclosing. The dream of a Dutch return to the Indies was ultimately defeated by the TNI's bamboo spears or by General Suderman's brilliant strategy. It was defeated by an amendment to a foreign aid bill in the US Senate. The Dutch government, faced with this undeniable reality, was forced to capitulate. The hardliners who had championed the military solution were finally overruled by the pragmatists who understood that you can't have national pride if you don't have a nation. Kicking and screaming, the Netherlands was about to be dragged back to the table for the final, humiliating round of the world's longest breakup. The phone call from Washington was the geopolitical equivalent of being grounded by your parents and having your allowance cut off. The Dutch government, which had been running its foreign policy on a potent cocktail of national pride and imperial nostalgia, was suddenly forced to sober up. The choice was stark and simple: continue your unwinnable colonial war and face economic collapse, or swallow your pride, get back to the table, and end this thing. They chose survival. The order came down from The Hague to their delegation in Batavia: fix this. Now. And so, with the grim reluctance of someone who knows they have absolutely no leverage left, the Netherlands agreed to talk, again. This was not a negotiation between equals. This was a court-ordered mediation. The talks that led to the Rome-Van Rooyen Agreement in May 1949 were overseen by the UN's Committee of Good Offices. But the real mediator was the looming shadow of American financial power. The Dutch delegation, now led by the more pragmatic J.H. Van Rooyen, was there to find the most dignified way to surrender. The Indonesian delegation, led by the calm and capable Mohammed Roem, was there to accept that surrender. The agreement they hammered out was not a final peace treaty, but a crucial set of preconditions, a logistical roadmap to get to the final peace treaty. It was a masterpiece of you go first, no, you go first, but this time, the Dutch had no choice but to go first. The terms were a stunning reversal of their entire position. The Dutch agreed to 1. Cease all military operations immediately. 2. They would release Sukarno, Hatta, and all the other Republican leaders they had kidnapped and exiled. And 3, and this was the most humiliating pill to swallow, they would allow the Republican government to return to its capital in Yogyakarta and resume its functions. In exchange for this, the Republican leaders, once they were freed and back in power, would agree to 2 things. 1, they would formally order their guerrilla army, the TNI, to cease hostilities. 2, they would agree to attend a final Grand Roundtable Conference in The Hague to work out all the messy details of the transfer of sovereignty. Just pause for a moment and appreciate the sheer scale of this Dutch climb down. For 6 months, their entire foreign policy had been based on the premise that the Republic of Indonesia was dead and buried. Operation Crow had been its funeral. Now they were being forced to personally exhume the corpse, perform CPR, and handed back the keys to the city. Every triumphant press release they had issued in December 1948 was now a source of profound national embarrassment. They had to publicly admit that their great military victory had been a complete and utter failure. Even with the Dutch on the ropes, getting the agreement sealed wasn't easy. On the Indonesian side, there was deep, justifiable suspicion. The military commanders in the field, led by the ever-defiant General Suderman, had seen the Dutch break every single promise they had ever made. They saw the Rome-Van Rooyen Agreement as just another version of the Linggadjati and Renville traps, a diplomatic trick designed to get the TNI to come out of the jungle and lay down its arms, at which point the Dutch would inevitably betray them again. It took a great deal of persuasion from the exiled civilian leaders to convince the military that this time was different, that the American pressure was real, and that this was their best path to victory. personified dialogue setting, a drab hotel conference room in Batavia. The UN mediator is present mostly to make sure nobody flips the table. USA is figuratively standing behind the Dutch negotiator with his arms crossed. Dutch negotiator, Van Rooyen, reading from a statement with all the enthusiasm of a man reading a eulogy for his own career. A hymn. The Kingdom of the Netherlands agrees to the unconditional release of all Republican leaders and will facilitate the restoration of the Republican government in Yogyakarta. Indonesian negotiator, Roem. We accept. Once our president is back in the palace and we confirm your troops are standing down, we will issue the ceasefire order and agree to attend the conference in your country. Dutch negotiator, under his breath. The conference where we will be forced to give away the jewel of our kingdom. Indonesian negotiator. Excuse me, did you say something? Dutch negotiator. I said, we look forward to the conference where we will discuss the future of the kingdom. Yes, that's what I said. USA, from the corner. That's exactly what you said. You're all going to be great friends. You're going to talk it out, and it's going to be a productive and peaceful transfer of power. Or I'm canceling your credit cards. Your choice. The Rome-Van Rooyen Agreement was the beginning of the end. It wasn't a peace settlement. It was the terms of surrender for one side of the war. It was a public acknowledgement by the Netherlands that their military strategy had failed, their political strategy had failed, and their international strategy had failed. They had been outmaneuvered in the jungle, outsmarted in the UN, and outmuscled by their own superpower ally. They were a fading empire being taught a brutal lesson about the new realities of the post-war world. The military conflict, the shooting war, was effectively over. The Dutch had lost. They had tried for 4 years to deny the existence of the Republic of Indonesia through force of arms, and now they were being forced to personally escort it back to power. The only question that remained was how, exactly, this 350-year-long, deeply toxic relationship would finally, formally end. That would have to be sorted out at the final, awkward and inevitable breakup summit in The Hague. With the Rome-Van Rooyen Agreement signed, the Dutch were now obligated to perform the most humiliating maneuver of the entire war, the Walk of Shame. In late June 1949, Dutch troops began their formal withdrawal from the Republican capital of Yogyakarta. This wasn't a tactical retreat, it was a surrender. As their columns rumbled out of the city, the silent, watching eyes of TNI guerrillas followed them from the hillsides. The Dutch had entered the city 6 months earlier as conquerors. They left as failures. Then, on July the 6th, the main event. A plane carrying Sukarno, Hatta, and the other exiled Republican leaders landed at the Maguwo airfield, the same airfield Dutch paratroopers had seized in their surprise attack. Their return was not a quiet administrative affair. It was a triumph. The entire population of Yogyakarta poured into the streets, waving red and white flags, singing patriotic songs, and chanting their leaders' names. It was a joyous, cathartic, and deafening explosion of national pride. After 6 months of brutal occupation and guerrilla warfare, their government was back. Their capital was free. The Republic had not just survived, it had won. But after the cheering crowds went home and the victory parade was over, a very different kind of reunion took place behind the closed doors of the presidential palace. This was the awkward family reunion. On one side of the room were the civilian politicians, Sukarno, Hatta, and the others. They were rested, dressed in their crisp white suits, and basking in the glow of a diplomatic victory won from their comfortable island exile. On the other side of the room were the men who had actually been running the Republic for the past 6 months, the military commanders and local leaders like the Sultan of Yogyakarta. These men were gaunt, weary, and still metaphorically covered in the mud and blood of the jungle. They had been fighting, hiding, and dying while the politicians were waiting, and they were deeply, profoundly suspicious. The politicians were eager to get on with the final phase of their plan. They had the Dutch on the ropes, American support in their pocket, and a clear path to the final transfer of sovereignty at the upcoming conference in The Hague. All that was needed was for the military to officially order a ceasefire. For the commanders on the ground, this was a terrifying prospect. They had just fought the Dutch to a standstill. They were winning the guerrilla war. Dutch morale was shattered, and the TNI controlled almost the entire countryside. And now the politicians waltz back in and tell them to just stop, to trust the Dutch to honor a piece of paper. After Linggadjati, after Renville, it felt like a trap. It felt like they were being asked to give up all their hard-won momentum for another diplomatic fantasy. This was the Republic's first great post-war test. Could the civilian government reassert its authority over the military that had become the sole embodiment of the state in its absence? The task fell to Sukarno. In a series of tense private meetings, he had to convince his skeptical generals. He had to make them see that the fight had moved from the jungle to the conference room, and that a ceasefire was not a surrender, but the final move in a winning chess game. Personified dialogue setting. A dimly lit room in the Yogyakarta Palace. The civilian leadership, personified by a smooth-talking Sukarno, faces the military leadership, a single, grim, battle-hardened general. Military. So, you are back. We held the Republic for you while you were away. Civilian. And we are eternally grateful for your heroism. Your struggle made our diplomatic victory possible. Now the final step is at hand. You must issue the ceasefire. Military. A ceasefire. You want my men to lay down their arms, to trust the Dutch. The same Dutch who tore up the last ceasefire and dropped paratroopers on this very city? The same Dutch my soldiers are currently chasing through the jungle like frightened rats? Civilian. The situation has changed. We have the Americans on our side. The Dutch have no choice but to follow through this time. The war is won. We just need to go to The Hague to sign the documents. Military. The war is won here, in the mud, not in some fancy European ballroom. For 6 months, the TNI was the Republic. We answered to no one but General Suderman and the people. We trust our rifles. We do not trust your treaties. Civilian, Sukarno, steps forward, his voice shifting from charming to commanding. And I am the president. I command the absolute loyalty of the people, and therefore, I command you. Your duty was to fight to protect the state. You have done it with more bravery than anyone could have asked. Now the state commands you to make the peace. The fight is over. Do not betray the Republic in its moment of victory by refusing to obey its government. This was a pivotal moment in the formation of the Indonesian state. In so many other newly independent nations, the victorious guerrilla army would simply become the new government, leading to decades of military rule. But Sukarno, with his immense personal authority, managed to pull the military back into line. He established for the moment the crucial principle of civilian supremacy. The generals, including the gravely ill but still revered Suderman, reluctantly agreed. The military had saved the Republic, and now it would have to learn to serve it. In early August 1949, the formal ceasefire orders were issued by both sides. After 4 long, brutal years, the guns finally fell silent across the Indonesian archipelago. The fighting was over. All that remained was the final, messy, and long overdue breakup conversation. The Indonesian delegation, a mix of Republicans and representatives from the Dutch-created federal states, packed their bags. Their destination: The Hague, the capital city of their colonial masters, for one last round of talks. With the ceasefire holding and the war finally over, it was time for the last, most awkward phase of the breakup, sitting down in a stuffy room to argue over who gets to keep the silverware. In August 1949, delegations from the Republic of Indonesia, the various Dutch-created federal states, and the Netherlands all converged on The Hague for the Dutch-Indonesian Roundtable Conference. This was it, the final summit. The setting was the Ridderzaal, the historic Hall of Knights in the heart of the Dutch government. The symbolism was inescapable. The leaders of a nation born in jungle warfare were now meeting their former colonial masters as equals, under the ancient vaulted ceilings of their own empire. This was the world's most complicated and emotionally charged divorce settlement. For 3 long months, from August to November, committees and subcommittees argued over every excruciating detail of the transfer of sovereignty. The Indonesian delegations, the Republicans and the Federalists, quickly formed a united front, much to the annoyance of the Dutch, who had hoped to play them off against each other. The conference agenda was a laundry list of thorny issues. They debated the future of the Dutch colonial army, the KNIL, and how its soldiers might be integrated into the new Indonesian military. They hammered out clauses protecting Dutch corporate interests and the rights of Dutch citizens who chose to stay in Indonesia. The Dutch even managed to score one last temporary victory. They insisted that the new nation be a federal state, the Republic of the United States of Indonesia, RIS, not the unitary republic the nationalists had been fighting for. The Indonesian delegation, pragmatic and exhausted, agreed to this structure for the time being, knowing full well it was a flimsy, Dutch-designed contraption they could easily dismantle later. Spoiler, they did, less than a year later. But all of these issues paled in comparison to the one that almost blew up the entire conference, the bill. Near the end of the negotiations, the Dutch delegation calmly slid a piece of paper across the table. It was an invoice for the total outstanding debt of the Netherlands East Indies colonial government. The amount was a staggering 4.3 billion guilders. The Dutch position was simple. The new sovereign state of Indonesia would be the legal successor to the old colonial state, and therefore, it must assume all of its debts. This was a bitter pill for the Indonesians, but what made it utterly, outrageously insulting was what the debt included. A huge portion of that 4.3 billion guilders was the money the Netherlands had borrowed and spent to finance its military operations against the Republic for the past 4 years. Let that sink in. The Netherlands was demanding that Indonesia pay them back for the cost of the war they had just fought to prevent Indonesian independence. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a home invader, after being fought off and arrested, sending the homeowner a bill for the crowbar, the ski mask, and the bullets he fired through the living room wall. Personified dialogue setting, a sterile conference room in The Hague. Lawyers for both sides are present. Dutch lawyer. And so, as outlined in Schedule C, Appendix A4, the successor state agrees to assume the full financial obligations of the preceding administration, totaling 4.3 billion guilders. Indonesian delegate flips through the document, his eyes narrowing. I'm sorry, I must be reading this wrong. This line item here. Expenditures for internal security operations 1947 to 1949. Are you telling me you want us to pay for your police actions? Dutch lawyer. Those were legitimate administrative costs incurred by the lawful government of the time. The maintenance of law and order is expensive. As the inheritors of that government, you inherit its balance sheet. Indonesian delegate. You mean the maintenance of colonial oppression? You want us to pay for the salaries of the soldiers who shot our people? You want us to pay for the fuel for the planes that bombed our villages? You want the victims of an assault to pay for the attacker's weapon? This isn't a negotiation, it's a shakedown. It's the most cynical, insulting proposal I have ever heard in my life. Dutch lawyer shrugs. It is a non-negotiable precondition for the transfer of sovereignty. No debt assumption, no independence. The choice is yours. This moment reveals the cold, calculating, and completely unsentimental core of the entire colonial enterprise. At the end of the day, it was all business. For 350 years, the Indies had been a source of immense profit for the Netherlands. Now that they were being forced to divest from their prize asset, they were determined to do so without taking a financial hit. The concept that they bore any moral or financial responsibility for the death and destruction caused by their attempts to keep that asset was, to them, simply absurd. It was an accounting problem, not a moral one. This demand wasn't born of malice. It was born of a worldview in which the colony's ledger had to be balanced, no matter what. It was the final petty act of a landlord handing the tenants a bill for all the doors he broke down while trying to illegally evict them. The Indonesian delegation was furious. The conference teetered on the brink of collapse. It took weeks of bitter argument and intense pressure from the UN mediators to find a way forward. In the end, a compromise was reached. Indonesia would accept the debt, but the amount would be slightly reduced to exclude some of the most direct military costs. It was a marginal concession, but it was enough to save the deal. The Indonesians, seeing the finish line, agreed to swallow this final bitter pill as the price of freedom. With the money sorted, only one major territorial dispute remained: a vast, remote, and sparsely populated land of jungles and mountains on the far eastern edge of the archipelago, West New Guinea. Just when it seemed like the end was in sight at The Hague, after the excruciating arguments over the debt were finally settled, the Netherlands decided to throw one last wrench into the works. As the delegates prepared to finalize the documents, the Dutch representative cleared his throat and said, "There's just one more small matter to discuss." That small matter was a gigantic, jungle-covered island on the far side of the archipelago, West New Guinea. The Dutch, having been forced to give up Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and everything in between, had decided they wanted to keep this one last piece as a souvenir. Their official argument was a classic of paternalistic colonial rhetoric, updated for a post-war world. They claimed that the people of West New Guinea, who are ethnically Melanesian and culturally distinct from the Malay peoples of the rest of Indonesia, were not part of the Indonesian nation. Therefore, the Dutch had a solemn moral duty to remain and guide the Papuan people towards their own separate, independent destiny at some unspecified point in the distant future. It was the old civilizing mission argument, dusted off and given a fresh coat of paint. The real reason, of course, had nothing to do with ethnography and everything to do with ego. Losing the East Indies was a traumatic amputation for the Dutch national psyche. It was the end of their status as a global power. Holding on to the vast, undeveloped territory of West New Guinea was a consolation prize. It would allow them to keep a foothold in the region, maintain a semblance of their former imperial glory, and have something to show for their 350-year investment. It was a desperate attempt to salvage a shred of pride from the wreckage of their empire. The Indonesian delegation was having none of it. Their position was clear, simple, and based on the iron logic of decolonization. The Republic of Indonesia, they argued, was the direct successor to the entire territory of the former Dutch East Indies. The borders of the new nation were not to be determined by ethnicity, an argument that would have shattered the multi-ethnic Indonesian archipelago into 1,000 pieces, but by the administrative boundaries of the colonial state they were replacing. West New Guinea had been governed by the Dutch from Batavia as part of the Indies, therefore it was an inseparable part of Indonesia. Their national motto was Dari Sabang sampai Merauke, from Sabang in the west to Merauke in the east in New Guinea. To them, giving up New Guinea was unthinkable. It was a betrayal of the revolution's promise to liberate the entire homeland. They saw the Dutch proposal for what it was, a cynical attempt to maintain a colonial cancer in their backyard. This issue became the final, immovable obstacle. The entire Round Table Conference, which had just survived the explosive fight over the debt, now ground to a halt. Days turned into weeks. Neither side would budge an inch. The whole painstakingly constructed agreement was on the verge of collapsing over this one remote, sparsely populated territory. Personified dialogue setting, the lawyer's office. Moments before the final signing of the divorce papers. Indonesia. Okay, everything is initialed, the finances are settled, we're done, let's sign and get out of here. Netherlands. Taps a map on the table. Not just yet. I've decided I'm keeping the vacation property. New Guinea. Indonesia. What? No. That's part of the estate. We agreed. The whole estate gets transferred. Netherlands. I've changed my mind. The people there need me. They're different from your side of the family. I have a responsibility to look after them. And frankly, after losing the main house, I deserve a place to get away from it all. Indonesia. You're not looking after them. You're trying to keep a colonial foothold you just can't let go. This is a deal breaker. If New Guinea isn't part of the package, there is no package. The war will start again. UN mediator, running in. Whoa, everyone calm down, no more war. Look, what if you just don't decide right now? Sign the papers for everything else and we'll put a little note at the bottom that says, "To be determined," next to the vacation house. You can argue about it next year. And that is exactly what they did. With the entire conference about to implode, the UN mediators scrambled to find a solution. And they came up with the greatest diplomatic cop out of all time. They kicked the can down the road. The final agreement of the Round Table Conference included a clause stating that the issue of West New Guinea's sovereignty would be set aside for now, and the two nations would resolve it through bilateral negotiations within 1 year. This wasn't a solution, it was a scheduled future crisis. Everyone in that room knew they weren't solving the problem. They were just postponing it to get the main deal done. The Netherlands got to save face by not immediately surrendering the territory, and Indonesia got to sign the documents for everything else, confident they could win the fight for New Guinea later. It was a deeply cynical move that planted the seeds of another bitter conflict that would erupt a decade later. The decision to postpone the New Guinea question is the perfect metaphor for the messiness of decolonization. It's never a clean break. There are always lingering resentments, unresolved issues, and lines on a map that will be fought over for generations. The Dutch, in their moment of defeat, were desperately clinging to a phantom limb of their empire, a symbolic piece of territory to soothe their wounded pride. By agreeing to this postponement, the conference had essentially signed a divorce decree that included a legally binding agreement to have a massive public fight a year later. But for now, it was enough. The final obstacle had been fudged. The treaties were printed, the pens were filled, and the signing ceremony was set. With the West New Guinea issue artfully kicked into the long grass, the final obstacle at the Round Table Conference was removed. The lawyers finalized the mountains of paperwork. The calligraphers prepared their fanciest pens, and a date was set. After 4 years of brutal warfare, 2 failed treaties, 2 police actions, a guerrilla insurgency, a UN intervention, and a threatened credit freeze, the end was finally here. The breakup was going to be official. The date was December 27, 1949. The transfer of sovereignty was a carefully choreographed event, taking place simultaneously in 2 capital cities, reflecting the 2 very different perspectives on the day's events. The first ceremony took place in the Grand Royal Palace in Amsterdam. This was the cold, legal heart of the matter. In a room heavy with history and the ghosts of empire, Queen Juliana of the Netherlands, with a voice full of regal solemnity, signed the official proclamation. She formally and irrevocably transferred sovereignty over the territories of the Dutch East Indies to the new Republic of the United States of Indonesia. Vice President Muhammad Hatta was there to represent Indonesia, accepting the transfer with quiet, dignified formality. For the Netherlands, this ceremony was a funeral. It was somber, respectful, and deeply sad, the official end of a 350-year-long chapter of their national story. But 1,000 time zones away, the second ceremony was a birth. In the former Governor-General's palace in Batavia, now officially and forever to be known as Jakarta, an enormous, jubilant crowd had gathered. The mood was not somber, it was electric. Inside the palace, the last Dutch High Commissioner formally handed power to the Sultan of Yogyakarta, representing the new Indonesian government. Then came the moment that everyone was waiting for, the single act that would make 4 years of struggle and sacrifice real. In the palace square, 2 flagpoles stood side by side. On one, the red, white, and blue flag of the Netherlands fluttered. A Dutch honor guard slowly, solemnly lowered it for the final time. The crowd watched in a kind of breathless, hushed anticipation. For centuries, that flag had been the symbol of their subjugation. As it came down, so did an entire era. Then, on the adjacent pole, an Indonesian honor guard began to raise their flag, the simple red and white banner of the revolution, the Sangsaka Merah Putih. As it climbed higher and finally caught the tropical breeze, the hush broke. The square erupted. A single, massive, joyous roar went up from hundreds of thousands of throats, a sound of pure, unadulterated catharsis. This was it. This was the moment. This was Merdeka. Freedom. The text chain that had begun on August 17, 1945, was finally over. That first proclamation was the "I'm leaving you" text. The Dutch had spent 4 years replying with a mix of "Lowell," "No you're not, who is this?" and a series of increasingly violent and threatening messages. The war was the world's most brutal fight in the DMs, but this ceremony, this final public lowering of one flag and the raising of another, was the ultimate read receipt. It was the Netherlands at last acknowledging the breakup. Message received. Relationship status terminated. Personified dialogue. Setting, a split-screen view. One side shows the opulent, silent royal palace in Amsterdam. The other shows the sun-drenched, roaring square in Jakarta. Queen Juliana, in Amsterdam, as a voiceover. Her voice filled with gravitas and melancholy. And so an end has come to the bond that has united our two peoples for centuries. We are no longer bound together. A new relationship is born. On the Amsterdam screen, Hatta shakes hands with the Queen. It is all quiet dignity and profound silence. A Dutch official, in Jakarta, watching the Dutch flag come down, muttering to his aide, "Well, there it goes. 3.5 centuries, all for nothing. Try to give them civilization and this is the thanks you get." The Indonesian flag starts to rise. The roar from the crowd begins to build, drowning out all other sound. A young Indonesian in the crowd, shouting to his friend, tears streaming down his face. "We did it. We really did it. My brother died at Surabaya for this. For this flag." The entire crowd, as a single deafening voice that echoes across the screen, "Merdeka, Merdeka, Merdeka." This is the profound duality of every decolonization moment. In the capital of the empire, it is an act of letting go, a moment of loss, a quiet closing of an old chapter. It is administrative, legalistic, and tinged with a nostalgia for a power that has faded. The dominant emotion is an ending. But in the capital of the newly free nation, it is an act of creation, a moment of pure, explosive beginning. It is emotional, visceral, and future-oriented. For the Netherlands, December 27, 1949 was the day they lost Indonesia. For Indonesia, it was the day they truly found themselves. The very same historical event can be a funeral and a birthday party, all at the same time. The documents were signed. The Dutch East Indies was no more. The sovereign Republic of the United States of Indonesia was a reality. The war was over. The struggle for independence, at least the armed part of it, was won. But as the euphoria of that first Independence Day began to settle, two nations inextricably linked by centuries of history, but now officially separated, had to wake up the next morning and face the difficult question that follows every messy breakup. What now? While the new nation of Indonesia was taking its first euphoric, chaotic breaths, the Netherlands was sailing home to face a profound and deeply uncomfortable silence. The divorce was final, and now came the harsh reality of moving into a smaller apartment and figuring out who you are when you're no longer part of a power couple. For the Netherlands, losing Indonesia wasn't just a geopolitical event, it was an existential crisis. It was a national identity implosion. For centuries, the Dutch self-image had been inextricably linked to its colonial empire. The Indies was more than just a source of staggering wealth, it was a source of national pride, prestige, and purpose. It was what made a tiny, low-lying country on the edge of Europe a major player on the world stage. A common saying of the time was India verloren, Rampspoed geboren. Indies lost, disaster born. The loss was felt as a deep, traumatic humiliation. They hadn't graciously granted independence in a fit of enlightened benevolence. They had been fought to a standstill by a revolutionary army, outmaneuvered diplomatically at the UN, and then strong-armed into surrender by their own powerful ally. It was a defeat on every possible level. The economic shock, while significant, was cushioned by the Marshall Plan. But the country still had to fundamentally re-engineer its entire economy, pivoting away from colonial extraction and towards becoming a modern, industrial, European trading nation. The real impact, however, was social and psychological. The end of the empire triggered a massive wave of migration. Over the next decade, hundreds of thousands of people left Indonesia for the Netherlands. This included Dutch-born colonials who had run the plantations and government offices, but also a huge number of Indos, people of mixed Dutch and Indonesian heritage who felt they had no place in the new republic. They arrived in a homeland that many of them had never seen, a country that was not the powerful, romanticized motherland of their imaginations, but a dreary, conservative, and economically shattered nation, still rebuilding from the rubble of World War II. The Netherlands of 1950 was not prepared for this influx of people who looked different, cooked different food, and brought with them the complex, painful baggage of a lost colonial world. It was a massive social upheaval that would shape the country for generations. Back in the halls of Parliament in The Hague, the blame game began immediately. Who lost the Indies? The political right blamed the spineless coalition governments for caving to American pressure. The left blamed the arrogant military hardliners for pursuing a brutal, unwinnable war that had alienated the rest of the world. The entire 4-year conflict became a black page in Dutch history, a source of shame, division, and angry debate that most people simply preferred not to talk about. It was a national trauma that was swept under the rug, left to fester for decades. Personified dialogue setting, a gloomy, metaphorical pub in Europe. The Netherlands is sitting at the bar, staring into a glass of Genever. Britain and France are at a nearby table. Britain, nudging France. Look at him. Hasn't said a word all night. Just sits there staring at the wall. The post-imperial blues. I had a nasty bout of it after India left. France sighs. Tell me about it. I'm still having nightmares about Indochina. You try to give them roads, wine, a proper bureaucracy, and they just throw it back in your face. It's the ingratitude that hurts the most. Bartender. Another one, Netherlands? Netherlands. Looks up, his eyes hollow. What's the point? I used to be somebody. I had an archipelago, the Spice Islands. The whole world envied me. Now what am I? A tourist destination for people who want to look at tulips and cheese markets. I'm a cliché, a medium-sized, moderately successful European social democracy. It's so boring. Britain. You'll get used to it, old chap. You focus on what you're good at. Banking, shipping, complaining about the weather, you'll find a new purpose. Netherlands. My purpose was being rich and important because of Indonesia. That was my purpose. They completed me. This is the untold story of decolonization, the quiet, painful identity crisis of the former colonizer. A nation that has built its sense of self on the subjugation of another has to learn how to exist without its pedestal. The Netherlands had to go through a long, painful process of national soul-searching. It had to shrink its conception of itself from a global empire to a European nation. It's a psychological adjustment that is, in many ways, just as profound as the one the newly independent nation has to go through. Over time, the Netherlands did adapt. It reoriented itself towards Europe, becoming a founding member of what would become the European Union, and found a new identity as a prosperous, progressive, and peaceful trading nation. But the legacy of the Indies never truly went away. It lived on in the food, in the faces of the Indish community, and in the deep, unresolved arguments about the war. While Indonesia was grappling with the loud, vibrant, and often violent challenges of building a brand new nation from scratch, the Netherlands was contending with the quiet, nagging, and melancholy challenge of learning how to be a smaller one. While the Netherlands was at home staring into the abyss of its post-imperial identity crisis, the newly independent Indonesia was having a party. The euphoria that erupted on December 27, 1949, was real and profound. They had done it. Against all odds, a nation conceived in haste and born in fire had won its freedom. But as anyone who has ever thrown a truly legendary party knows, the morning after is a brutal reckoning. And for Indonesia, the hangover was a geopolitical migraine of epic proportions. The leaders of the revolution woke up on December 28th, surveyed the scene, and collectively asked the terrifying question, what now? Winning a 4-year war against a European empire, it turns out, was the easy part. Now they had to actually run the place. And the place wasn't a neat, tidy little nation-state. It was the world's largest archipelago, a sprawling, dizzying collection of 17,000 islands, hundreds of distinct ethnic and linguistic groups, and a population of 80 million people who until very recently had only one thing in common, a shared desire to get rid of the Dutch. Now that the Dutch were gone, all the deep-seated internal divisions came rushing to the surface. First, there was the political problem. The nation they had inherited was the Republic of the United States of Indonesia, RIS, a federal structure designed by the Dutch to keep the central government in Java weak. This was anathema to the nationalists who had fought and died for a strong, unitary republic. This problem at least was solved with impressive speed. The Dutch created federal states, most of which were puppet governments with no popular support. quickly collapsed. One by one, they voted to dissolve themselves and merge with the original republic. By August 1950, on the 5th anniversary of the initial proclamation, the federal system was officially scrapped, and the Unitary Republic of Indonesia was born. But that was just the beginning. The country was an economic wasteland. Years of Japanese occupation, scorched earth tactics, and Dutch blockades had shattered its infrastructure. The new government was flat broke, and to add insult to injury, it was saddled with billions of guilders of colonial debt that it was now expected to pay back to the Dutch. The military was also a mess. The celebrated TNI was less a single, unified army, and more a fractious coalition of professional soldiers, local militias, and Islamic fighting groups, all with competing loyalties and agendas. Forging this revolutionary force into a disciplined national army would be the work of a generation. And almost immediately the centrifugal forces of the archipelago began to pull the new nation apart. Not everyone was thrilled about being ruled from Jakarta. In the South Moluccas, the Spice Islands, former soldiers of the Dutch colonial army declared their own independent republic. In West Java, an Islamist movement called Darul Islam waged a long and bloody guerrilla war to establish a religious state. The dream of unity and diversity was immediately put to the test by bullets and bombs. Personified dialogue setting, the brand new chaotic head office of Indonesia, Inc. President Sukarno is standing in front of a giant, messy whiteboard. Sukarno: "Gentlemen, we are free. The future is ours." Now to the business of nation building. First on the agenda, dismantling this absurd federal system the Dutch left us. Java, head of operations: "Excellent, sir. We'll centralize everything in Jakarta, much more efficient." Sumatra, head of resources: "Hang on a minute. Centralize? Does that mean all the oil and rubber money from my department flows straight to your office in Java before I see any of it?" The outer islands, a crowd of junior managers at the back: "Yeah. What about us?" South Moluccas, head of security, walking out the door with a box of his things: "You know what? I'm out. I was a loyal employee of the old Dutch firm for generations. I don't trust this new management. I'm starting my own security company. Good luck." Sukarno sighs, rubs his forehead. "Okay. So, national unity is a work in progress. Let's move on to item 2. The economy. How much money do we have in the bank?" An aide whispers in his ear. Sukarno: "What do you mean we have to pay the Dutch 4 billion guilders? We won the war." This is the profound challenge of nation building. A revolution is a beautifully simple story. It's us versus them. But governing is a complex, messy, and often thankless task. It's us versus us. The leaders of the revolution had to transform themselves from fighters into bureaucrats. They had to figure out how to create a single national identity that could feel like home to a Javanese Muslim, a Balinese Hindu, a Christian Ambonese, and a Dayak animist. President Sukarno, with his immense charisma and his national ideology of Pancasila, 5 principles, became the human glue trying to hold this fragile creation together. The initial joy of independence was quickly tempered by the immense grinding weight of its responsibilities. The fight for freedom was over, but the fight for Indonesia's future was just beginning. And that fight would not be against a foreign colonizer, but against the deep fractures, rivalries, and contradictions within itself. One of the most painful of those fractures involved a group of men who had been their brothers and their enemies all at the same time: the Indonesian soldiers of the Dutch colonial army. As the new Indonesian government grappled with its massive list of post-independence headaches, one problem stood out as particularly painful, complex, and tragic. It was the human wreckage of the Dutch colonial military machine. The tens of thousands of Indonesian soldiers who had fought loyally and brutally for the Dutch in the Royal Netherlands Indies Army, the Colonial, now that their Dutch masters were gone. These soldiers were left in a terrifying limbo, hated by their countrymen and abandoned by the crown they had served. To understand this dilemma, you have to understand what the Colonial was. It was not a Dutch army stationed in the colonies, it was a colonial army, through and through. While its officer corps was mostly European, The vast majority of its professional, long-serving soldiers were recruited from specific indigenous ethnic groups. For centuries, the Dutch had perfected the art of divide and rule, and their military recruitment was the ultimate expression of it. They deliberately sought out soldiers from minority communities, often Christian ones, like the Ambonese from the South Moluccas and the Menedanese from North Sulawesi. They fostered a unique military culture within these groups, creating multi-generational families of professional soldiers whose identity and loyalty were tied not to a vague concept of Indonesia, but directly to their regiment, their comrades, and the distant Dutch Queen in Europe. For 4 years, these highly trained KNIL soldiers had been the backbone of the Dutch war effort. They had fought fiercely against the TNI, who they viewed as undisciplined, extremist rebels. The TNI, in turn, saw the KNIL soldiers as the ultimate traitors, black Dutchmen who had turned on their own people for colonial pay. The hatred between the two armies was personal and visceral. The Round Table Conference Agreement stipulated that the KNIL would be disbanded. Its soldiers would be given a choice: either join the new Indonesian National Army or be demobilized. This was an impossible choice. For the new Indonesian government, absorbing these puppets into their revolutionary army was a distasteful but necessary evil. For the KNIL soldiers, the idea of serving under their former enemies, the terrorists they had just been trying to kill, was an unbearable humiliation. This tension exploded in the South Moluccas, the heartland of the Ambonese KNIL soldiers. Feeling betrayed by the Dutch and fearing persecution in the new Indonesia, a group of Ambonese politicians and ex-KNIL soldiers declared their own independent state in April 1950, the Republic of South Maluku, or RMS. It was a desperate act of self-preservation. The response from the central government in Jakarta was swift and ruthless. Determined to crush any challenge to their new unitary state, they sent the TNI. What followed was a bitter civil war, pitting the best soldiers of the old colonial army against the hardened veterans of the Revolutionary Army. It was Indonesian against Indonesian, a bloody postscript to the main War of Independence. The TNI eventually crushed the rebellion. Fearing for their lives, about 2,500 Moluccan ex-KNIL soldiers and their families were evacuated to the Netherlands. This was supposed to be a temporary measure until the situation cooled down. It became permanent. This evacuation created the large and vibrant Moluccan community in the Netherlands, but it was a community born of trauma, exiled from their homeland, feeling abandoned by the Dutch government, and living for decades in a state of political and cultural limbo. Personified dialogue setting, a metaphorical discharge office. A proud, decorated Ambonese KNIL sergeant stands before a Dutch officer and a TNI officer, who are processing his demobilization. Dutch officer, avoiding eye contact, shuffling papers. Right. So, Sergeant, as per the agreement, the KNIL no longer exists. On behalf of the Queen, thank you for your centuries of loyal service. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. KNIL Sergeant, that's it? Thank you for your service? We fought and died for you. My family has served your crown since before Napoleon. You are just leaving us here? TNI officer, your queen is gone, but your nation is here. The new Republic of Indonesia offers you a place in its national army. You are a good soldier. We could use you. KNIL Sergeant, a place in your army? The army of undisciplined rebels who I have been fighting for 4 years? You are the enemy. My home is Ambon. My loyalty is to my people, not your Javanese republic. Dutch officer, that's not our problem anymore, I'm afraid. Good luck. He leaves the room quickly. TNI officer sighs. So be it. If you will not join the nation, then you are against it. We were enemies yesterday. It seems we will be enemies tomorrow as well. The story of the KNIL soldiers is the most tragic human cost of the Dutch divide and rule policy. The Dutch had spent centuries deliberately cultivating a separate identity and a fierce, insular loyalty among certain Indonesian groups, turning them into a powerful tool for controlling the rest. And when the colonial project finally collapsed, the Dutch simply dropped their tool and walked away, leaving it to be smashed by the new political reality. The Ambonese soldiers were caught in an impossible bind. They were loyal to an empire that saw them as disposable. and they became traitors to a nation that they had never been encouraged, or even allowed, to be a part of. They were the ultimate victims of the breakup, left homeless by the divorce of the two powers that had defined their entire existence. The suppression of their rebellion was a brutal but necessary act of consolidation for the new Indonesian state, but it left a legacy of bitterness that echoes to this day. The messy, tragic postscript of the Colonial soldiers was the last painful echo of the war itself. With the internal rebellions crushed and the Dutch gone, the two nations could finally begin to take stock of the 4-year-long chaotic, bloody, and world-changing argument they had just endured. Both nations now looked back across the water at each other, scarred and transformed, and had to contemplate the messy legacy of it all. It was, they both had to admit, a terribly inefficient and painful way to end a relationship that should have been over a century earlier. For Indonesia, the legacy of the revolution was its very soul. The shared struggle against the Dutch was the single most powerful unifying experience in the nation's history. It was the crucible that forged a powerful, overriding sense of Indonesian-ness out of 1,000 disparate island cultures. The war created a pantheon of national heroes: Sukarno the Proclamator, Hatta the diplomat, Sudirman the warrior, and a powerful founding myth of heroic resistance against a colonial Goliath. The Indonesian military, the TNI, emerged from the conflict as the most trusted, powerful, and organized institution in the country. A position of prestige and influence it would hold for the rest of the century, for better and for worse. But this violent birth also left deep scars. It set a dangerous precedent that national unity could and should be maintained through force. The US versus them mentality of the revolution was a difficult thing to turn off when the new challenge was building a tolerant, multi-party democracy. For the Netherlands, the legacy was one of trauma and transformation. The loss of the Indies was a profound blow to the national ego, the end of its global prestige. For decades, the war remained a black page in Dutch history, a subject of bitter political division and a deep, collective silence. But this painful amputation also forced a necessary reinvention. No longer able to rely on colonial wealth, the Netherlands had to look inward and to its neighbors. It fully committed to becoming a modern European nation, pouring its energy into trade, industry, and the grand project of European integration. The loss of its empire was, paradoxically, the event that made the modern, prosperous, and progressive Netherlands of today possible. Globally, the Indonesian Revolution was a landmark event. It was one of the first successful, large-scale wars of national liberation in the great wave of decolonization that swept the globe after World War II. It provided a powerful inspiration and a tactical blueprint for independence movements from Vietnam to Algeria. It was a stark demonstration that the age of European empires was over, and that a determined nationalist movement, even one armed with bamboo spears, could ultimately defeat a modern European army. Personified dialogue setting: a quiet, metaphorical park bench years later. An elderly, stooped Netherlands and a confident, middle-aged Indonesia are sitting a few feet apart, watching the sunset. Indonesia: it's been a long time. Netherlands: nods slowly. Indeed. You've done well for yourself. A big, noisy, complicated family you have there. Indonesia: it's a struggle always. We argue a lot, but they are my arguments to have. How have things been with you? Netherlands: quiet, orderly, very prosperous. My tulips are world famous. Life is stable. But sometimes, on a quiet night, I can still almost smell the cloves. Indonesia: we both made a lot of mistakes back then. Netherlands: the biggest mistake was the fight itself. We should have just listened to you in 1945. It would have saved everyone so much trouble. Indonesia: a small, sad smile. Yes, but you couldn't. It's hard to listen when you're used to being the only one who talks. And that's the final, simple, and maddening truth of this whole epic mess. It was also utterly avoidable. The arc of history was bending decisively away from colonialism after 1945. Indonesian independence was inevitable. But because of a toxic combination of Dutch pride, post-imperial denial, and a complete failure to recognize that the world had changed. A transfer of power that could have been peaceful was transformed into a 4-year inferno. It's a tragic lesson that the most destructive forces in history are often not the grand impersonal tides of economics or ideology, but the simple, very human, and very foolish refusal of those in power to accept that their time is up. And so, after 4 years of proving they were much better off apart, Indonesia and the Netherlands finally broke up, leaving behind a legacy of awkward family reunions, deep psychological scars, and one very confused island in New Guinea. Now, as a final reminder, please do not cite this podcast in your history thesis. Your professor will cry. But I hope you'll agree our version was way more fun and involved significantly fewer footnotes. What other historical train wreck should we personify next? Let us know in the comments. We're thinking the War of the Spanish Succession, which was basically the world's most violent and complicated inheritance dispute that dragged in the entire neighborhood. And that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't invade Russia in the winter.